It's the big one, folks. Revolution has two new sets joining the roster this coming rotation as opposed to the usual one. We have so many cards to get through, with the incumbent sets coupling together to bring us over 550 new cards to consider. By my estimation, I'll be covering over 70% of those cards we're gaining here over this wildly long two-part mega review. So as always, links to the custom MTG Discord and relevant resources are in the description below, as well as links to the Kitsuo and Weft GitHub pages, and the combined future set search on Manifesto for you to dig through all these sets have to offer and what the field will look like starting May. So for those unaware, heading into this rotation, there was a special announcement a week into April 2025 about the future of Revolution, with the biggest change being that every May, starting this year, we will have two sets rotating in as opposed to the usual one. We're only having one set rotate out in Hyperpop, so that's a full additional set's worth of cards in the field for the next 2 years, with the goal being to eventually have 8 sets in rotation at a time from the previous 6. This isn't changing how long existing sets are going to be in the format. This isn't changing how long these new sets are going to be in the format. Every set still gets exactly 2 years. It's just changing how many sets get those 2 years starting May 1st. As a result of this shift, we have 2 new sets joining the fray as opposed to our usual one. We can officially welcome Errors in the Weft, designed by Dr. Chipmunk and heralded by its renegade promo, the Weft Heart, as well as Kitsuo Dusk of Time, designed by Provocative and heralded by Emperor Zuhan and his adventure by Right. For the sake of going through all of these cards in a relatively organized fashion, we'll be breaking things down into categories. We'll talk about all of the mechanics of each set first, then the lands these sets bring into the field, then we'll move through each color from white, then blue, then black, then red, and finally green. After that, we'll round things out with the multicolor cards and the colorless cards. In the first half of this review, we'll be going over everything up to and through the black cards. Red through colorless will be in part 2. In case you're wondering why I'm doing that, just look at the video length and ask yourself that again. Some final things to note. Every design we see here is subject to change. I imagine we'll have a decently sizable set of patch notes to address things on May 1st, so while I'll be doing my best to cover everything I think is worth consideration, I can't see the future and I don't know what cards will and won't be changed. These sets were both designed anticipating them being the only set to be joining the format in May 1st, so there are naturally going to be some things that have to be adjusted to accommodate the fact that they're joining at the same time. Whatever gets changed, don't worry, there will be a start of May patch review covering all of those changes. So let's just focus on what we currently have to look at, and then we can tackle the bigger picture stuff of what we actually get when we actually get it. Additionally, you may need to bear with me here. This is a wildly daunting task I have ahead of myself. A peek behind the curtains, I don't have an editing software I can safely run on my computer without it causing some serious issues. So this video, which is also true of all of my videos you see, is all one take. Yeah, I may have some verbal flubs, I may stumble over my script, I may go off script, I'm sure you might have heard I had to clear my throat. It's just going to be kind of doing what I have to do because there is an intense amount of card discussion we have ahead of us, and it's just, I have to get through it. It's part of why I had to split this into two parts. I had folks who were worried for my own well-being if I tried to record all of this review in one sitting. So the second part is going to take a little bit longer. I have not finished scripting that, but once I decided to make this a two-parter, I decided I had enough for this first part, and I wanted to make sure you all did not have to wait. So I'll do what I can to make sure what you have is easily navigatable. Timestamps for every section. I'll have to put I had to consider putting a break in between the black and red cards already as sort of a, like, take a moment to breathe break. But the separate recordings, I think, is going to be a much more stable way to put that break. So bear with me as I work my way through the card catalog we have to cover, and just understand that I'm working my hardest to get the second part out to you as soon as I can. So without further ado, let's dive into the review. Kicking off the mechanical suite of Kitsuo Dusk of Time, we have 3 universal mechanics, as well as 5 more restricted to corresponding color pairs. The first of those universal mechanics is Cycling, a very familiar face from official Magic. On the off chance you aren't familiar, Cycling is an activated ability that allows you to discard a card from your hand to draw a card. Relatively simple, and good to help smooth things along when you can't or don't want to use the card in question. Additionally, there are a few cards with the type-specific cycling abilities, such as Plain Cycling or Mountain Cycling, which allow you to search your library for a card of that type, usually a land type. Cycling appears in all 5 colors of Kitsuo Dusk of Time. And just to knock these out ahead of the individual color sections, each of our incumbent sets has a suite of land cycling cards at common. They're unremarkable, they cycle for 2, but they could be somewhat intriguing with the right graveyard synergies. And each group has a mutual creature type that does a kind of funky thing, though for the errors from errors in the Weft, that's kind of just a single synergy card that demands better errors to care about. The Kitsuo ones, being dragons, is vaguely interesting for use with Iviana, our blue-red planeswalker from GQ Chaos Reigns that gets a dragon from your sideboard while making 2 treasures. So at worst, I guess Iviana's Wish ability can now go find a land. Another familiar mechanic in Kitsuo is Adventure, which lets you cast the alternate instant or sorcery on the card and exile it as it resolves, then opening up the base creature to cast from exile at a later point. Adventure also appears across all 5 colors in Kitsuo. The final universal mechanic for Kitsuo is Time Loop, a saga-specific mechanic found on a cycle of monocolor rare enchantments. They function like normal sagas, progressing as they enter and after your draw step, but reset to 0 lore counters after their final ability resolves instead of sacrificing. We'll go over each card in this cycle at their respective sections in the review, but do note that if these sagas lose their abilities, say from a Sonido uptick, they will still sacrifice because the time loop ability that keeps them from inherently sacrificing will be gone. The first color-specific mechanic is Flow, found in white and blue. Flow abilities are activated abilities that allow you to tap your creatures while paying costs to pay for generic mana, though you'll need to pay colored mana normally. In black and red is Damned, a conditional ability that checks if you sacrificed a permanent this turn. In red and green, we have Revered, which allows creatures with it to share their abilities out to other creatures you control if those creatures have counters on them. +1/+1 counters, ability counters, even stunned counters work for Revered. In white and black, we have another returning canon mechanic in Exalted, which appears both in individual instances and in the form of Exalted counters across a few cards, granting a creature you control +1/+1 per instance of Exalted when that creature attacks alone. And our final mechanic for Kitsuo is another returning mechanic in Ninjutsu, found in green and blue, which is an activated ability that allows you to pick up an unblocked attacking creature you control to slip your ninjas into play, tapped and attacking. As for our errors in the Weft mechanics, let's start with the big one. Subroutines are an enchantment subtype, inserting a subroutine into one of your programs as it enters, and then running that subroutine at your first main phase if you move to the program it's in. The best way to simplify things here is just going to be to show you the tokens. There are 3 program tokens to represent the different places your subroutines can be, programs A, B, and C. As your first subroutine enters, you can place it in any program. At your turn, if you still control that subroutine, you'll move to program A and begin working through your programs turn by turn from there, running the ones in A first, then the ones in B, then finally the ones in C, before looping back. Moving to your next program only happens if you control a subroutine as your first main phase begins, so there's no need to worry about tracking your programs while you don't have any subroutines in play, and the designer has even openly said that there's no harm in just deleting your programs if you have no subroutines on the board. Subroutines are found in all 5 colors, with each color additionally having a signature token, created by a common and uncommon, but the subtype is most prevalent in blue and red. Next, we have caching and memory tokens. Caching a card exiles it while creating a memory enchantment token, which you can sacrifice for 2 mana to play the exiled card that turn. Caching can be done to cards from your library, hand, graveyard, or even permanents or spells on the stack, but cards from your library will usually be cached face down, hiding the information from your opponent, but allowing you to know what card you're exiling. Cache and memory tokens are in all 5 colors, but are most prevalent in white, blue, and green. Also, I might have misspoken on the stack. I said that in the moment, not seeing it on my script, and I think I'm wrong. Bear with me. Our final universal mechanic in the Weft is Level Up. This set's only canon mechanic to make a major appearance. Leveling up is an activated ability you pay as a sorcery to put level counters on creatures you control, causing their text box and stats to change as they reach certain quantities of level counters. Level Up is also found in all 5 colors, but is most prevalent in white and black, and I'm realizing Voice of Utopia has had a slight change that is not reflected on this slide. You'll see what I mean when we get to white cards. Weft also has 2 other mechanics, the first of which is Corrupt. Corrupt is a conditional mechanic that checks for you to control a permanent with greater mana value than the given source for a bonus effect, such as a 2-mana spell checking for a permanent with mana value 3 or greater. Corrupt is mostly in black and red, but there is a single Corrupt card each in blue and green. Last for our mechanics is Fabric, which just checks the number of enchantments you control. Fabric is exclusive to green and white. Let's get started with lands now, and specifically get started with land cycles before moving on to individual lands. Our first cycle is a monocolor creature land cycle from Errors in the Weft, with each entering tapped and having their respective basic land type. They level up for 3 mana of their given color, becoming a creature with a single keyword at 1 level counter, and getting a significant stat boost upon reaching 3 level counters. Stack Conviviplex is our plains, becoming a 2/3 with a lifelink at level 1 and a 5/6 at level 3. Archive Telemetrary is an island that becomes a 1/6 with a vigilance and upgrades to a 4/9. Heap Ludicon is a swamp that becomes a 2/4 with death touch and upgrades to a 6/8. Grip Festivarium is a mountain that becomes a 3/1 with menace and upgrades to a 6/4. And finally, Buffer Reconservatory is a forest that becomes a 3/2 with Ward 2, eventually becoming a 7/6. Of all of these, Archive Telemetrary seems the safest, as it never leaves you without the mana, but all of these seem pretty risky and reliant on getting deep into the game to yield the most use. The best I can say for any of these, though, is that Stack Conviviplex, being a plains, means you can find it with Contest Coordinator. Let's talk about the big star of the show, though. We have 4 dual land cycles to talk about. This is all tentative, as many come from Errors in the Weft, anticipating having to carry the banner on filling the void we have for competitive dual lands all by itself, but all 4 of these cycles are worth discussing. First is the Shockland cycle. We've seen the enemy Shocklands before, having them back in Kutalia from their original suite of sets that Revolution started with, but prior to now, we hadn't had the allied shocks in the format, so this is a boon for Eternal as well. These don't have land types like the shocks you may be used to in canon Magic, but speaking from experience, these are a huge boon for the format at large. Just be wary of knocking your life too low for aggressive decks on the other side of the table. The other set of untapped duels is our 1 cycle from Kitsuo, the Paths. They're duels that cycle for 2 mana and enter untapped if they're your first or second land of the game. I think these strike a fine balance, though they apply more pressure to the early land drops alongside Primal Fissure and Temple of Origins, also checking for early land drops, though those at least can be your 3rd land. That said, I think these are a great tool to help supplant Temple of Origins and open up splashes more reliably, and the cycling makes these perfectly fine to draw later in the game. Also worth noting, any land with a way to ship to the graveyard right now is going to feel a little bit better thanks to Surface caring about cards in your graveyard and Unflinching Titan wanting to pull lands from your bin anyways. Next are the slower duels, starting with the Soul Spaces. These are typed duels that always enter tapped and let you pay 4 mana plus tapping to cast the top card of your library face down. Their biggest source of competition is the Pledge duels from Cliques of Nylon, which pledge for 4 mana without tapping, and the enemy Pledge duels in particular are really strong for their ability to get any of the 5 Clique tokens that you might want. The biggest leg up that the Soul Spaces have there is that they can be activated at instant speed, and they yield proper card advantage, just at a higher tax and in a way that's more vulnerable to enchantment removal. That said, Cliques are also enchantment tokens, so I think, they have the same general drawbacks, and you could have either in your slower decks depending on which you value more. Last of our land cycles are the Enter Fetches. These sacrifice on enter to search up a basic land of one of 2 types to play tapped. but can also be discarded for a hefty mana cost later on, always requiring at least 2 of each of their respective colors. In order, and this is going to be a bit long-winded, we have Silent Lakefront, which discards for 1 white, white, blue, blue to counter target spell and gain you 3 life. Lost and Found, which discards for 2 blue, blue, black, black to surveil 2 and draw 2 cards. Faulty Server, which discards for 2 black, black, red, red to make a 4/4 red error creature token with menace at instant speed. Ardent Rise, which discards for 1 red, red, green, green to give target creature you control +2/+0 for the turn and have it bite an opposing creature. Reified Burrow, which discards for 1 green, green, white, white to create 3 tapped 1/1 white citizen tokens. Isolated Tower, which discards for 2 white, white, black, black to exile target non-land permanent. Meteoric Facade, which discards for 2 blue, blue, red, red to deal 3 damage to any target while drawing you 2 cards and making you discard 1. Forgotten Junkyard, which discards for 2 black, black, green, green to rebuy up to 1 creature and up to 1 enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. Glittering Club, which discards for 1 red, red, white, white to give your creatures +2/+1 for the turn, and Regrowing Outlands, which discards for 1 green, green, blue, blue to create 2 tapped tokens that are copies of a land you control. All of that said, I think these are interesting options if you're willing to bite the bullet and run a fetch that always gets your land tapped, and isn't as flexible as your normal options. The relative uniformity of the costs around 5 to 6 mana means they're easy enough to envision when they'd become important, and a number are interactive effects or otherwise means of generating card advantage with a land from hand, especially if they're the land you top-decked. Also worth noting is that these are not easily interactable on the stack, as they're activated abilities from a land source, circumventing traditional counterspells as well as effects like Bind. Lastly, as mentioned with the paths, lands that send themselves to your graveyard are looking better right now thanks to the graveyard tools we have access to, so don't sleep on these. Now on to our individual lands, starting with Gate to Fujinobe. It taps for colorless. You can pay 2 to tap it for 2 mana of different colors, or you can pay 4 and tap it to look at a card from the top of your library for each unique color pairing you have among your permanents. Taking 1 card from that bunch and adding it to your hand. The immediate place my mind goes is Shrines, as the uncommon ones are all unique 2-color permanents that can help escalate that card selection mode rather quickly. The reality, though, is that I suspect Gate to Fujinobe might just be a safe candidate for draw-go control, where you run 2 or 3 colors and just get to have a certain number of 2-color permanents in your deck to satisfy its condition for at least 1 permanent consistently to draw with it. The general utility of Shrine to Keranos in those slower style decks will definitely help this show up in fair strategies, but I could see a number of slower decks giving this a shot at one point or another. Next is Avatar Exchange, which is tough to evaluate on the surface. It's a classic mechanic-specific land that fixes for any color of mana, only to be used with relevant cards and abilities. I'm largely skeptical of level up being generally strong enough to justify the number of card slots that would be required to enable this being reliably useful, but the final ability to have it become a copy of a creature you control with level up is definitely appealing. The big drawback there, however, is that Avatar Exchange will stop being a land and become the creature without any level counters, meaning that any effort you had to expend to level up the one creature just kind of got doubled if you want them both to have their leveled abilities. That being said, there are some interesting things I could conceive of doing with this, such as having it copy one of your leveling things once they become a creature. One of your leveling lands. I said things. One of your leveling lands once they become a creature. Keep this card in the back of your mind. We may revisit it later. Also built to fix mana for a particular mechanic is Opulent Village, though it is available for a more universally playable mechanic and comes with an effect we've seen be constructed viable before. Colorless mana sources have their own degree of viability right now, thanks to Cyberos's colorless theme, and one of the better colorless lands that has been utilized to help pay colorless costs in Revolution's history harkens back to Monsters of Chikyu with Healing Center. Radiant Fountain is a perfectly fine card when you're looking for lands to tap for colorless, and it's made better when Opulent Village perfectly fixes for cards we already know could be viable. The Fourth Worlds Championship has already had a decent showing for Laystone of Being, one of the 5 Laystone cards from Cyberus that are all castable turn 1 off of Opulent Village and are all easily cycled by it. As it stands, Opulent Village into Laystone of Being is now a means to develop a 3/3 creature and a repeat life gate engine that could generate further tokens down the line for only 1 mana on the first turn of the game. I don't know if that means we're due for another classic Laystone change, as the cycle has been subject to so many, or if Opulent Village will just have to take the hit instead, but I can't imagine the curators are keyed on that particular play pattern. Next is Protean Bows, which taps for colorless or mana of any color if it just entered. More importantly, you can pay 4 to tap it to create a tapped 1/1 colorless fox shapeshifter with Changeling, letting it play into a few critical themes in the field. The two biggest immediate homes that come to mind are Golems and Solidarity. The former already does have a land capable of making Golem tokens, and ultimately Protean Bows is less efficient at making your 1/1 Golems than any of the actual Titans or Skypillar, so I think it's maybe not the best there. As for Solidarity, it's actually not so great there either, due in no small part to the high cost of creating the token, even if the token single-handedly fulfills the Solidarity requirement. Now, I think the real application here might just be for control. It's a decently appealing control tool, and the mana restriction on its token ability, while pretty debilitating even if it makes a tapped blocker, is perfectly fine if you're just holding up a bunch of mana. Now, while the token from Bows is made tapped, which could hurt its viability in this context, it doesn't require you to be in 3 colors to use like Skypillar, and it can even fix for mana the turn you play it, so it's not the most stellar card, but it's worth keeping tabs on. We have just 2 more lands to get through, these ones a bit simpler. Jubilant Docks is a color-picking bounce land, feeling very reminiscent of the rotated shifting layer, though with the catch that you have to lock in the color it can produce. Layer has seen play here and there in Returns to Eternal Seasons, largely with things like Dawnglade Cultivator as a way to accelerate land drops while using Shifting Layer to augment the number of lands needed in hand to utilize them, as well as taking advantage of how good Layer is to untap with anything that just untaps a couple lands. For Docks, it can mostly do those same things, though the critical support pieces are really not in rotation, and it's not as flexible as Shifting Layer because you have to lock it into a specific color. However, we did just get a set at the start of the year with a major landfall theme, so maybe a bounce land could be in a good place right now. Also worth noting, the green Laystone does untap one of your permanents at your end step. Untapping your Jubilant Docks lets you hold up 2 mana instead of 1, which could be the difference between holding up interaction or even just using cycling abilities more reliably. Finally, we have Royal Balcony, which just taps for colorless and surveils for 1 on enter. It does, notably, have basic land cycling for 2, making it relatively easy to use for color fixing when you really need to. But it's also beneficial to use for some of the land from graveyard synergies we've got, like Unflinching Titan and Dormant Camel. Not remarkable, but nice to have around. Alrighty, as we move into white, I think we need to talk about the biggest elephant in the room for cycling in general, which is Emperor Zuhan. Ignore that adventure for now, it's lying to you about being a 5-color card. Zuhan himself is a 3/3 for 2 and a white that flickers creatures you control whenever you cycle a card, with the limitation being that he cannot flicker himself. Zuhan is one of the biggest incentives in the set for pushing a cycling matters strategy, and there are a number of creatures floating around both in the current field and in the incoming sets that do play pretty nicely with him. From combo potential with cards like Reconnaissance Agent, Urban Explorer, and Rib Collector helping you rebuy the cards you're cycling, to more general usage with things such as pledge creatures like Melon or Demographer, tempo enter triggers like Unspeaking Titan or Agent of Deception, to even control lines like using him with Benthelos to keep copying your removal enchantments. He's admittedly not the most overwhelmingly amazing support piece. He's pretty fragile as just a 3-mana 3/3 that sits there, and in all honesty, there are other Cycling Matters tools that I personally rate higher than him, but there are still things he can do that's interesting. As far as his adventure goes, we will get back to buy right later, I promise, just not in the multicolored section. Keep your eyes peeled for a Kitsuo rare in black that has a lot to do with Zuhan. In the meantime, we move on. Kitsuo has 4 white cards worth talking about that all have cycling in some fashion, though only 2 actually draw cards. Let's start with the weakest and work our way up. Blur Strike is quite honestly unremarkable. An aura that grants Double Strike has its advantages to be sure, but auras need a lot to work right, especially when they're competing with blessings that come stapled to otherwise perfectly fine creatures. Put simply, I don't see Blur Strike coming anywhere near close to the viability of something like Bacillo Lion of Valor. Now, if we ever get things that care about enchantments in graveyard, maybe an enchantment with cycling could be nice, but don't get your hopes up. Especially when... Next is Perils of Eternity. It's a decent anti-combo sideboard tool that prevents players from casting multiple spells a turn unless they control a planeswalker. The only reason you'll ever be using its cycling cost is with Ayeshi times Jailer in your deck. Now, we'll get into them in more explicit detail in the second part for the multicolor section, but for now, all you need to know is that Ayeshi is a decent controlled tool, but restricted to banned colors, so it's kind of hard to find too many homes for them. It's immediate removal for smaller permanents, which our other banned planeswalkers in the field have no easy claim on, but they're otherwise kind of clunky. Again, we'll dig into it further, but honestly, I don't think Ayeshi is reason enough to run Perils of Eternity and vice versa. The cycling mode honestly feels more like trinket text there to make it so opposing removal causes it to count as a cycling card in your graveyard. That said, Perils is a good enough sideboard tool in the right circumstances. Did I say something about enchantments with cycling? Welkin Eviction is a much more appealing card than the last two. 6 and a white for an enchantment with flash that costs X less to cast, where X is the number of planes you control plus the number of cards with a cycling ability in your graveyard. Otherwise, it's Banishing Light, exiling a non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves, and coming with plane cycling for 2 when you need it. I don't think you need to care about both planes and cycling for this to be great. Care a little bit about white and have a lot of cycling tools, and it's reliably cheap. Care a lot about white, but not so much cycling? Great, still pretty cheap. Folks have been casting Gone Pickin' for the last 3.5 months with relative eagerness, so having an option with Flash that could just be cast for less as well in the later game is going to be swell. Just do be wary that it's much worse than Gone Pickin' in the early turns of the game. Fall of Volantin has been doing some great things in a heavy white-focused white-blue control deck, and this seems a great consideration there. Also notable, as is true for all cycling cards, it's got an activated ability, which means GQ Chaos Reigns synergies are going to benefit, including this being a viable pick off of Contest Coordinator. Speaking of white enchantments with cycling, this might be a bit surprising considering I just talked up Welkin Eviction in comparison to Gone Pickin', and that's because Sealing Strike is just Gone Pickin' but with a cycling cost instead of a berry. The reality, though, is that some of the best decks currently available in the Revolution field can weaponize Gone Pickin' are things like Abzan Midrange and Bant Builder, decks built around lower curve interaction pieces and 3-color mana bases. And having a Banishing Light that you can find off of Contest Coordinator and Kaineos Bladebound is honestly just great. Though it hasn't been showing up alongside those cards as of late, it's also a valid hit off of A Journey Begins, in case you were curious. Beyond the cycling package, we'll go through both sets white cards together in ascending mana value, starting with Danusia, Emperor's Pet. Danusia is a 1/2 flyer for a single white that shares its evergreen keywords with your attacking creature if it attacks alone. This effectively guarantees that at a minimum your single attacking creature will have flying, but my gut says there are interesting things to do with this in Genome Project, but ultimately once Genome Project is rolling, your attacking creatures will have most of these abilities anyways, so it's just a 1/2 with flying at that point. It's nice early on, and it's a solid means of sharing some of these keywords around when you don't have a Genome Project set up, but I'm not sure this is going to see a ton of play. Ophuda Mistress is a more aggressively slanted stat line and feels very reminiscent of the old Kutalia card Veil-Touched Soulbinder. Ophuda Mistress is a 1-mana 2/1 that exiles a card from your opponent's graveyard when it becomes tapped, and can be tapped for 3 and a white to make it a 1/1 monk with vigilance if you don't want to attack. I think the token mode here is pretty unreliable, but the fact that it can be activated at instant speed both serves to make it a more appealing card to leave up, and makes it trickier to allow you to use it as a way of sniping cards from graveyards at instant speed. I appreciate how this plays into synergies like Flow, and it crews vehicles like a champ, but I think it might struggle to find a good home. That said, main deckable graveyard hate is in high demand as it could ever be, especially with premium graveyard hate like Soul Guide Lantern being on its way out at the end of the summer. Assert Mediator is another interesting 2/1 for 1, cashing the top card of your library on enter, but doing so for your opponent as well. From there, it's just a 2/1 for 1, though if you're in green, you can spend 3 in a green to give it +3/+3 once each turn, making it a decent card in mid to late game board states if you have green mana to spare. I also think the biggest thing here is nothing to do with its text box, but the fact that it is a 2/1 for 1 with Advisor on its type line, meaning it plays well into an already established white aggro deck. In my mind, Advisors has been wanting another good aggressive 1-drop, which Mediator perfectly slots into, and the deck putting pressure on your opponent's mana means the memory token you give them will be harder to justify cracking. It can even do niche things like messing with the top of your opponent's deck if they scry or surveil a card to the top and then pass, meaning Mediator can tax them for wanting to play that particular card. The true queen of white 1-drops in this rotation, however, is actually the most innocuous. Kitsune Matriarch is a 1/1 for 1 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you create one or more tokens. Revolution has been, is, and will continue to be an environment with a weirdly wild amount of token generation. Even barring the incoming cash tokens from errors in the Weft, we have a bunch of berry token pieces that have struggled to see play since the combo builds of the deck took a hit back in February, as well as a bunch of other artifact token pieces such as Wayward Drek. The key here is that Matriarch wants individual token creation events rather than single cards that spit out a bunch of tokens. And I can tell you right now, our new sets do help that out a bunch. Matriarch has a lot going for it heading into this field, with the only real weakness being a classic one. It's an awkward 1/1 for 1 on the top deck, so better for aggressive plans that find it early, and maybe still solid for mid-range decks if they spit out enough tokens. 2 triggers already makes it great for the cost, and it can only get better from there. In case you're doubtful about this 1/1 for 1, just look at how notorious Seeker of New Horizons has been at the heart of green-based aggro decks. Sure, Matriarch is a worse top deck, but it isn't locked to trigger once per turn from land drops, and it doesn't place any restrictions on your mana base. That said, I don't think Kitsuo is the only set bringing a hammer of a 1-mana creature to the field. Voice of Utopia is one of the best level-up creatures in Error in the Weft, starting as a 1/2 with Vigilance that can level up for 1 mana, though you'll have to tap an untapped creature in addition to do so. From there, Voice stays as a 1/2 with Vigilance, but from levels 1 to 5, it gets +1/+1 for each level counter on it, making it a scaling threat as you take the time to level it up, and effectively just treating the level counters as +1/+1 counters. But it eventually peaks at level 6, where it grants that buff to all of your creatures instead of just itself. It's hard to fully discuss where Voice of Utopia sits in terms of the field at large, but it feels very reminiscent of Symbol of the Revolution, which rotated out of the field in January and was a major player throughout its tenure. Voice lacks the evasion of Symbol, but the reliable scaling and easier to space out mana investment makes it a better card to sink time into if you have that time to spare. It's especially good with creatures that want to become tapped, such as Dated Mechanoid, which could supply an additional +1/+1 to the Voice whenever it's used to level it up, and puts the level 6 Anthem to excellent use thanks to its inherent First Strike. Any creatures that look good for flow look good with Voice here as well, and it having Vigilance means it can even still level up without any bodies while still applying pressure. Plasma Strike is a pretty simple removal spell for 1 mana, but there is a lot to like here. It deals 3 damage to target attacking, blocking, or tapped creature for a single white mana, allowing you to pick off a good chunk of creatures in the format without much mana investment. This feels most comparable to Walk the Dead's Path, which can do the same for 2 mana, but misses out on hitting tapped creatures outside of combat in exchange for the flexibility to remove enchantments. Walk may outshine Strike for the next few months, due in large part to how important enchantment removal is looking to be, but Plasma Strike may start supplanting it in situations where the creature removal is key, particularly in cases like control decks looking to shore up their aggro matchups over prioritizing enchantment removal. It won't outright replace Walk the Dead's Path, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Walk's quantity being lowered in sideboards to make room for Plasma Strike or 2 moving forward. As far as cheap removal in white goes, Revolution has been very reliant on funky conditional removal like Seal Away, and just generally reliant on enchantments that temporarily remove things in general for a while now. Now, though, Swift Reproach offers us a solid long-term exile option, provided you just don't care for enchantment synergies. For 1 and a white at instant speed, you can exile a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, giving its controller a card draw if they have fewer cards in hand than you when this resolves. I think Swift Reproach seems stellar, enough so that I would dare to invoke one of Revolution's most ubiquitously powerful removal spells relegated to Eternal in Event Horizon. Horizon is more catch-all, hitting any permanent type, but is conditional on hitting mana values less than or equal to the greatest number of non-land permanents a player controls. In Eternal especially, Horizons largely removes anything and everything on account of how much that format incentivizes lower mana values, but it does still have targets it struggles to hit, like Tyrant of Tributes. In rotation, however, there are plenty of scenarios where you will find yourself across from a threat that's just a bit too problematic. Kaineos and Builder Monuments don't tap to expose themselves to Seal Away, Shangfa and Skotha are too high mana value to be picked off with planned obsolescence, and sometimes you need to hit stuff outside of your turn to pave the way for game actions on your turn, making catch-all sorcery speed options like Gone Pickin' and Stealing Strike a bit awkward. While Reproach's potential drawback can be fierce, I'd contend that there are plenty of cases where Reproach's immediacy and certainty do wonders for helping you keep the board turning in your favor. It's not the absolute best removal option White has right now, but it is really up there. Also intriguing for filling the 2-mana removal slot is Lost Connection, which is more color intense as it requires double white, but it can force any non-land permanent to be cached. Well, the baseline here is that you force your opponent to replay the targeted card for 2 more mana down the road, making this more of a tempo removal spell. There are some funky things you can do with the right pieces of Enchantment Disruption. Hungry Blob and Disestablishmentarianism can both help to negate the drawback here, either by picking off the memory token to keep the card exiled for good, or by preventing your opponent from sacrificing the memory to begin with. The mana cost here is awkward, but if these cute, and even if these cute interactions don't line up, it's a very serviceable piece for tempo decks, as mentioned before, and it seems decent. Sculptor's Replica is a genuine, real-deal, actual factual golem, meaning White now has the most playable support for golem decks. Kind of. It's a 2/2 artifact creature for 1 and a white that has flow for 4 and a white to create a tapped 0/0 golem token with +1/+1 for each artifact you control. While the golems we have in the field aren't artifact and aren't largely in white, they certainly appreciate ways to dump more into play, and I'd much rather tap a random golem to pay for the flow cost than have to pay 3 and tap the Titans for a 1/1. This plays very nicely with the 2-mana golem token spells in the Ruins Awaken and Ragtag Squad, converting those 1/1s into fodder to help smooth the flow cost here, and obviously the critical mass helps to make Unspeaking Titan and Unflinching Titan attack more reliably. I have pretty high hopes for Bant Golems in the coming field, potentially even with a Black Splash to still get the final Titan in there, and while it may not be top of my list for GP decks, it's certainly something I'm eager to take for a spin. Route Navigator is a tech card I haven't seen a lot of chatter about so far, but there are a lot of things to like about it in the current environment. It is a 3/1 for 1 and a white with flash that keeps players from searching for non-basic cards whenever they search their libraries. With toolbox cards like Builder of Monuments, Get Your Wish, and Ozon's Blessing having some play in the format, as well as land engines like Istrathian Gentrifiers helping to find duals and utility lands, Navigator is a great way to keep those pieces in check, whether your opponent is using Builder to find Planned Obsolescence or Ozon's Blessing to find Unspeaking Titan. In fact, I think Route Navigator could paradoxically be a great card to include if you yourself are on an Ozon's Blessing plan, as a 1 or 2 of in the sideboard for matchups where Navigator could just have been played. Blessing being a 4 of means that even with just a single Navigator in your sideboard, you have 5 cards that you could draw to get it when you need it in those matchups, and you can play your own Blessings around the threat of Navigator shutting them off in your own deck, or even use Blessing to find Navigator in response to an opposing search. The disruption potential is pretty high here. Weave Dispatcher is a card that caught my interest for its potential in token strategies with enough non-token creatures in the shell. For 1 and a white, you get a 2/1 advisor that triggers whenever another non-token creature you control enters, letting you pay 1 to make a subroutine token that creates a 1/1 citizen whenever it runs. At a baseline, you'd need 3 triggers and 3 payments for this to start creating what amounts to 1 token a turn consistently, which is not exactly remarkable, but the fact that those subroutines can keep spitting out tokens even after Weave Dispatcher is removed means it can help provide longer-term value. With creatures like Eo the Great Equalizer and Ardor Forefront of Freedom eagerly looking for repeat token generators, there is a lot to like about an innocuous 2/1 that offers value the longer you can keep it around. It's also just solid at helping to stall the board in a pinch, which is always nice. Male Daemon is appealing, but seems a bit harder to find a clear home for. It's a 1/1 flying enchantment creature with lifelink, and it draws you a card when it leaves the battlefield, so my first instinct is to call this a great option for ninjutsu strategies. But unfortunately, the competition for evasive creatures is pretty fierce, and is only getting fiercer. We'll dig into this more as we get to the ninjutsu cards itself, but when Charming Siren represents a ninja that also comes with removal, it's hard to justify wanting a 2-mana 1/1, even if it draws you cards. Undo is a nice equalizer for slower decks to bring up against aggro strategies. What did I write there? To catch up against aggro strategies. It's a subroutine for 2 mana that can gain you 3 life when it runs if your opponent has more life, and creates 2 1/1 citizens if your opponent has more creatures. It's a similar design seed to High Senator Talpa, which has had some chatter around her when she first joined the format back in September, but ultimately hasn't seen a ton of use thus far, owing in part, I think, to the one-shot nature of her effect coupled with her 4 mana cost. I think Undo's repeatability, if you get enough turns with it, is a high marker for its playability, especially as the time it takes to run it again is time you'll likely be spending taking damage and losing those creatures, meaning it can help fight to stabilize a pretty reliable board state for control strategies. While I would love to see Talpa get her time in the spotlight, Undo makes it likely that her role as a sideboard card will be a bit short-lived. Though, of course, as is true for most subroutines, this does require some pre-planning. If you need it to save you the turn you play it, it is an awful card to top deck. Mask isn't all that exciting on its own, but it does function as a side grade to Narzi, Hero of the Mokar, in Genome Project decks. Not a great marker, I promise you. One of the best keywords Genome Project can share around is indestructible, allowing you to lock down the board and make it harder for your opponent to punch through your creatures. And as a result, though Project decks haven't really taken off as of yet, Narzi always makes an appearance in those strategies when people try them. She plays very nicely with Project, allowing you to stack her triggers, so Project grants her the indestructible she just gave to another creature, along with all of the other keyword counters you have in play. However, she can be awkward in the face of needing to time her well, where she's often worse if you don't have a Genome Project available, as her wander cost is so prohibitive. That is where Mask comes into play. It's a subroutine with the same base effect as Narzi, flashing in for 2 mana to give a creature you control +1/+1 and indestructible for the turn on enter, but it also repeats this effect whenever it runs. This allows you to play it as a flexible protection piece rather than needing to commit to it enabling Genome Project, and it'll then serve to help you tee up Genome Project triggers on a later turn depending on what program you leave Mask on. While I don't think Genome Project will get a huge resurgence by any means, I do think Mask is a solid contender for potentially even replacing Narzi and making the indestructible granting sequences far more flexible and reliable. Telepresence Axiom is a card. It's a 2/1 artifact creature for 2 that caches the top card of your library. Nothing too special, nothing too remarkable. If you're desperate for a trinket creature that can kind of draw a card, it's not the worst. The only reason I'm really bringing it up here is because cards with multiple types in white have an asterisk next to their names for eternal, thanks to Piece Together, which asks you to put 3 types of permanents into play each turn to draw a card each turn. With Telepresence Axiom being an artifact creature that makes an enchantment token, that alone satisfies Piece Together's condition, making it a fantastic card to at least consider in that environment, especially with how low the curves of those decks are making the card you cache more reliably castable. I don't think Axiom will make a lot of waves in the current rotation, but keep it in the back of your mind for the variant formats at the end of each season. Imperial Tour has garnered a bit of mixed reception in the first few days of scrutiny. It's a 2-mana enchantment with Exalted that searches up a legendary white card and puts it into your hand if you cast it. At first glance, taking a turn off to cast a 2-mana tutor with pretty restricted options is kind of rough, but there are so many things this card finds, resulting in it gaining hype as folks have taken time to evaluate it. Just in the 5 sets staying in the field this rotation, this finds Kaineos on curve, can get the Kanai Stone, Melon, Laystone of Being, the Quindril Chords, and Benthalos, the last of which can even copy and cast a new Imperial Tour if needed, and that's not to mention every Planeswalker in the field that casts for white mana. This is part of what really kills Perils of Eternity as a Planeswalker tutor in my mind. Why spend 3 mana to Ayeshi cycle for just Ayeshi, when you could pay 1 less mana to develop an enchantment that contributes devotion, sets up Exalted for incidental value, and has a larger scope of what it can find? Illusory Savior is a funky one to analyze, because at its base rate, it's not a stellar blocker, but by itself, it does swing for 3. The big appeal here is that its sacrifice ability protects your creature from non-exile removal for no mana. While the obvious use case of running it as a protective piece for an aggro mid-range strategy is, of course, there, it's also worth noting that the sacrifice is for free because it returns the creature you target to play after that creature dies, rather than just giving it indestructible or anything, meaning there is a combo to be had. With 3 copies of this in play, you can sacrifice 1 to protect another, sacrifice the second to protect the third comes back, then you sacrifice the third to protect the third comes back, and you have a loop.
Smiling Sludge, or really any aristocrat effect, gets the job done from there, so the puzzle then becomes, how do you find all three copies, 3 of the 4 copies you need of a specific 2-drop? If you can solve that puzzle, maybe there's something to do here, especially since Bind Life to Steel returns Smiling Sludge and any of your copies of Illusory Savior for 1 mana per card you want to get back in its X cost, since it gets back twice X mana value worth of cards. Imperial Honor Guard is kind of spooky, if I'm being honest. It's a 2/2 flyer with Exalted that makes all non-basic, non-samurai permanents enter tapped, but we don't have many components for a deck right now that would be particularly keen on Hate Bear effects. However, this is great at keeping opponents from setting up defenses and checking the push towards more non-basics that this rotation otherwise promotes. It's really hard for me to say what cards this wants to get run alongside, in all honesty, but whatever does want it could put it to phenomenal use. Elder Tattooist is our closest bet to make sure the rotation of Yeji next month doesn't hurt the strategies she propped up too much. It's a 3/3 with Vigilance for 2 and a white, and has a sorcery speed flow ability that exiles and makes a tapped token copy of a permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard for 4 and a white. Now, obviously, paying mana to cheat value permanents out of your graveyard is far less explosive than getting them for free while you're doing other things, but Tattooist does have some things to like, namely that you aren't as priced into rushing out cards in your hand to get your value. Tattooist seems inclined towards slowing the game down to get the most of its ability, whereas Yeji felt best when she was helping you rush your opponent down, owed in part to how much Amp It Up pushes you down on cards in hand and demands you swing at your opponent. Considering some of the best tools to get back with Yeji wound up being somewhat suspect in those more aggressive shells because of the slower value-oriented effects they provide, like Path of Phalanx, Tattooist looks to be much more effective at utilizing the value of those effects to their fullest potential. It's hard to say that this will truly see play, but it's definitely appealing. In all honesty, many of the adventure cards did not impress me in Kitsuo, but Ayeshi's Agent was one of the few that did catch my eye. Now, 2-mana flickers have an iffy history in Revolution, in that ones limited to creatures are much more unreliable than ones that are able to hit any permanent. For instance, why cast Perimeter Seal to flicker a creature when Brief Stop can flicker your value enchantments, and can even flicker a creature and preserve it from a board wipe? Well, Agent's 3/3 body for 3 has an interesting triggered ability, proccing every time you exile 1 or more cards from a graveyard or battlefield to make a 1/1 bird with flying. Now, I think the best case scenario for this card is you care about both halves here, the flicker and the token creation, but even just on its own, the token making works really well with engines like Scrapyard Mecha and Eyes of the Bureau. But, lost my train of thought. Scrapyard Mecha and Eyes of the Bureau, as well as individual exile pieces like maybe Sporeback Jarga and company. I'm most curious to see if this will result in an uptick in the use of Sensor Tablet, who I'm just realizing why that was visible last slide. That was a mistake on my part. It had me a little confused. As a repeatable way to pick off cards from the graveyard, with Ayeshi's Agent giving an in-deck reason to want Tablet in the main, and Tablet helping to keep graveyard synergies in check. Got through it. a bit sloppy, but we got there. Graceful Finalizer is a very needed card in this day and age, though it is a little clunky. As a 3/2 for 2 and a white, it's easily splashed, and its enter trigger letting you choose between exiling an enchantment and a player's graveyard helps it call the field's biggest components into question. So much of the format has been ruled by enchantments that either accrue value or keep a permanent removed while they're in play, and so many graveyard synergies just utterly run over any attempt to fight for the board. The big concern here is that Finalizer is just slow enough that you can't ever guarantee it does the job on its own and does the job in time. But with the right shelf for it to support in, this card could be the best of both worlds, helping supplement the need for enchantment exile like Cloud 9 and graveyard clears like Soul Guide Lantern. But the challenge becomes finding a shell that can truly maximize this card's use. Flicker spells do seem key here because they help it to both stick around through attempts to clear the body and allow you to rebuy its enter trigger at instant speed. Speaking of graveyard shenanigans, Return is another card that invokes the soon-to-depart Yeji, bringing back a creature with mana value 3 or less to play whenever this subroutine runs. Return seems particularly potent in the places of strategies like the old Extraction Mission shells, bringing back your Barbarous Rough Riders again and again to pressure the opponent down and force them into a tricky spot. But Return feels a fair bit slower than the tools that came before it, as any subroutine without an enter trigger is bound to do, and the delay means you forecast to your opponent what they need to do to keep you in check. Without adequate interaction from the opponent, though, return could help to fight for the board again and again. Futurist Ideal is an intriguing anthem to help support go-wide strategies, casting for 1 white and giving your creatures +1/+1 passively, while also making a player reveal cards from their hand equal to the number of enchantments you control and allowing you to cash one of them. One of the more interesting places to push enchantments right now is with token strategies, supported by tools like Sparks of a Revolution, Harmony with Nature, and Flags on High to provide either repeat token generation or otherwise just keep your enchantment count high. And in that regard, Futurist Ideal is particularly effective because it is incapable of missing. You can choose and cash a land from your opponent's hand, meaning that the enter trigger always gets the opportunity to throw your opponent off balance in a pinch. And there's no better place for an anthem than a deck that's really pushing to go wide. Download Courier is a 3-mana 2/2 that makes the alarm token we discussed earlier when it enters, allowing you to create a 1/1 citizen every 3 turns when the enchantment runs. I don't think Download Courier is particularly exciting on its own, but the proliferation of flicker effects joining the field does have it looking a bit more exciting. It also helps that tokens seem to be getting pulled in 2 paths between non-token creatures that make creature tokens and enchantments that put bodies into play. So something simple like Download Courier could help to bridge the gap there. I'm not sure this will be meaningful enough, of course, but hey, it's an interesting popper card if and when we revisit that variant format in a 4th month GP. Containment Seraph is yet another option to improve your removal suites in this coming rotation. It's a 2/1 flying artifact creature for 3, and it exiles a non-token creature you don't control on enter for good, only granting your opponent any reward in the form of cards and life gain equal to half the card's exiled mana value when it leaves. Those numbers do round up, so it's much more awkward to have to use this on a 3 or 5 drop since you're granting your opponent additional resources if this leaves. But as a 2/1 flyer, it's also just good at chipping in for damage uncontested on some board states, especially since you can aim its enter trigger towards picking off whatever could block it. The almost unconditional nature of this removal makes it good in a lot of board states, even if the leave trigger can be pretty rough. And with tools like Senaido being unable to favorably remove it due to it losing its leave trigger from her +1, there's a lot to like here. Also worth noting, because that leave trigger is separate from the enter trigger, you can flicker this in response to its enter trigger, and then that first exile, your opponent gets nothing from. Yokins in general is another puzzler that I don't have a defined home for, in part because I really don't have faith in Exalted as a full strategy. It's a 2/2 for 1 white with Exalted, and it draws you a card when you attack with a single other creature. The baseline of it pushing 1 extra damage from your best attacker while drawing a card seems alright, especially while it's in white with solid value 2 drops like Contest Coordinator to curve into this, but ultimately it feels awkward to rely on holding back your creatures to get value when they don't work, unless you can make that attack. Making board stalls a one-way ticket to your cards no longer functioning beyond being a means to clear 1 chump blocker every turn. Dragon of Recollection is a card I have a lot of excitement for. It's 2 and double white for a 2/2 flyer that on enter returns up to 3 target creature cards with total mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to play as long as it was cast. Now obviously with the Cast Rider this isn't going to be doing any flicker shenanigans, but it does do a lot to help mid-rangey creature decks keep up with the board. While the increasing prevalence of exile-based removal, and especially the reliance on Banishing Light effects, can hurt Dragon of Recollection a fair bit, I think in a Mardu shell with pieces like Ignited Soul or the Devoted Lackeys package, Dragon of Recollections represents a solid bit of value for jumping back on the board. Also worth noting, I never finished this script. Also worth noting is that Iviana Dragon Tamer is always happy to see new dragons joining the fray. So while it may not be the best in Dragon Age per se, the 2 treasures Iviana generates means you can guarantee you'll have the double white to cast it, and you could just get back a gubernatorial fundraiser. That's not the worst case scenario. Anyways, Imperious Admin is a card I am of 2 minds about, as the potential here is very high, but the floor is pretty abysmal. It's a 3/3 Vigilant Flyer for 2 white, and its Fabric ability flickers another creature or enchantment you control once each turn as a sorcery for 5 mana, though that costs 1 less to activate for each enchantment you control. I have paid a lot of lip service so far to the idea of a Naya tokens and enchantments strategy so far, I said so far twice. And a lot of the best cards in this shell have relevant enter triggers or otherwise care about having things repeatedly enter to get the most value. In that regard, a deck that wants to build a high fabric count while generating creature tokens seems like a perfect place to squeeze this in, especially if even if you're just using this to flicker flags on high. However, in those contexts, Imperious Admin seems a tad underwhelming due to its inability to be activated for cheap, especially when your opponents are inclined to pick off your enchantments that keep generating value. Now, there is another thing worth mentioning here, which is the much less wholesome strategy, using Admin to flicker your Omens of Slaughter and Phynax's Touches and other back-breaking utility enchantments. This is the avenue I see as being stronger with Imperious Admin, which has me a little frightened about the state of the field as a whole, but there are small victories. If this proves to be a key strategy, we only have 4 more months of this flickering Phynax's Touch and Omen of Slaughter ahead of us. That's not a good sentence to have to say. Exit is an interesting Wrath effect, coming down at 4 mana and destroying all creatures, planeswalkers, and enchantments when it runs. This feels most reminiscent of Bring the House Down, which is departing from the format as we gain Exit. Bring could be forecast for 1 fewer mana or hardcast for 1 more, giving you more control of when it could come into effect, whereas Exit is always locked into being at least a 1-turn wait, and it always has to be locked into the exact weight that you're anticipating. So it's hard to make it super available to save you in a tough spot, especially since it could clear away planeswalkers and enchantments you might be relying on. But with our other 4-mana sweeper being so white mana intensive, maybe Exit could see use in slow decks that lean more on multiple colors. The big win here is that if you aren't as invested into the board, you don't have planeswalkers and enchantments you care about, it can sweep those types, making it more reliant into opposing control decks in a strange way. The other big win here is that it misses artifacts, so you can build with that in mind and find an avenue for your artifact engines to get rolling once Exit pops. Probably one of my most anticipated cards in Kitsuo is Revolt at the Palace, White's Time Loop Saga. For 4 and a white, you get an enchantment whose first and second chapter abilities let you put a non-land permanent with mana value 3 or less from the top 6 cards of your deck into play, while giving your creatures double strike on the 3rd chapter. I honestly think this would be playable even without Time Loop, as the overall value here is getting 2 3-drops and then letting your attacks the turn after hit a significant deal harder. With Time Loop, however, I think the value gets even more clear-cut. If your opponent cannot meaningfully deal with Revolt at the Palace, it will invariably tick towards taking over the game. This finds Kaineos, Ominous Slaughter, finds any Banishing Light variant that sits below 4 mana. It finds Contest Coordinator. It finds sideboard tools like Soul Guide Lantern and Disestablishmentarianism. It's got a pretty clean avenue to inclusion in already established shells like Abzan Midrange, which, as well as opening up paths for some serious competitive viability with other strategies. With Time Loop offering a lot of power in the incoming field, it's worth noting that even if this is something I talked about. I talked about this before I got to it in the script. Even if they don't sacrifice normally, removing their abilities will still take them off the board. So if you're really concerned about Time Loop, look at Senaido. She can pick off Time Loop sagas just on her uptick. But maybe also just run enchantment removal. Enchantment removal is really important right now. The Dutiful Wanderer is our first planeswalker of the review, and while she has a lot going for her, there is a huge asterisk next to her because of the existence of Illustrious Shang-Fa. The Wanderer is a 3 white 4 loyalty planeswalker that says each opponent who casts a spell this turn can't attack the Dutiful Wanderer, and each opponent who attacked her this turn can't cast spells. She +1s to make a 2/2 white samurai with Exalted, and -3s to exile a creature you control and one you don't, permanently removing the opposing creature and flickering yours. I like a lot of what Wanderer has to offer, flickering your value creatures while picking off the opponent's threats, or just upticking to make a solid suite of defenders that let your single attacks hit harder. As is true of any planeswalker, she gets better with Contest Coordinator helping you find her, but that's a bit further bolstered with Coordinator being a great target for the -3. The major complication here is, of course, that Illustrious Shang-Fa is such a powerhouse of a card right now, even after its nerf in March. Shang-Fa locks opponents from casting more than 1 spell a turn, makes tokens that can trade with larger attackers on a +1 as well, can recur permanents from your graveyard, such as value enchantments or creatures, or even repeatedly remove things with planned obsolescence. And his big downtick takes him to 1 loyalty is a full board wipe as long as you have a creature, artifact, and or enchantment you don't mind losing. Wanderer is going to be able to do a lot of powerful things, but I think she's going to struggle to step out of Shangfa's shadow. As while Wanderer is great for mid-range strategies that don't want to reach for Shangfa, the slower the deck gets, the harder it becomes to justify not just playing Shangfa instead. Though maybe you could still justify swinging both. It's a rough situation for our new 5-mana white Planeswalker, I think. I'll be entirely honest here. I think Darisha Stack Exec is one of the most singularly terrifying cards in Era of the Weft, and she does so in a stunningly fair fashion. For 1 and quadruple white, she's a 5/5 with Vigilance that creates an Anthem token named Stratagem whenever she enters or attacks. This means she is a 6/6 immediately and attacks for 7 the first time she does so, while always being able to be held up as a blocker. The escalating anthems mean that any tokens or other creatures you have around will gradually get more out of hand the longer she sticks around, whether you're running her in a dedicated tokens strategy or even just as a piece in a control deck to help buff up your Shangfa tokens or 100-handed pillars if she can't get the job done. She is a must-answer permanence that produces more must-answer permanents, making the only surefire safe way to fight her be while she's on the stack. She's a bit vulnerable on the stack, and she is vulnerable in play too, but if your opponent's removal is leaving you with a permanent Anthem, that's pretty good, especially if it's leaving you with multiple. For all the time I've spent hyping up the enchantment token spam strategy, you think I'd be all over Centennial Maestro. It's a 3/3 for 4 and a white that makes a 1/1 citizen on enter for each enchantment you control. Unfortunately, though, I think this requires too many things to be going right for you, and a lot of the best token synergies right now actively want repeat token generation rather than explosive bursts of tokens. I think this starts looking less awkward around 5 enchantments, which requires your opponent to be pretty uninterested in removing your permanents, or probably killing you as well, both of which seem very unlikely in the current field. Kimja Jailer is pretty unimpressive, but does represent an alternative include in one specific strategy: bulk bioengineering, which has had to settle for Soothing Singer as its removal spell of choice, at least in green-white bioengineering. Now, Kimja Jailer's higher mana cost and limited set of targets are big liabilities, but I do like the larger body you get, and I think bulk bioengineering is a shell that could really put the Exalted trigger to use under the right circumstances. I don't expect it to be an all-star, and I don't even think it pushes Soothing Singer out of contention by any measure, but it's a nice alternative if you're looking for options, especially since bioengineering plus an Unyielding Titan means the Jailer casts for 1. Auspicious Return is a Haymaker enchantment, one of many reanimation effects we're getting in these new sets to help supplement a strategy that has been struggling as of late. For 4 and double white, this enchantment returns a creature card from your graveyard to your battlefield on enter, flickering one of your creatures at each of your end steps from there on out. This struck me as being largely janky at first, and it probably will be overall, but with Kaineos being as strong as he is, maybe there could be something worth doing. As it stands, Bant Builder runs some potent creatures that demand removal from the opponent, and I could see an argument being made to try run Return as a form of recursion that also generates value by flickering your Kaineos and Contest Coordinators. All this said, I think Return is better in a dedicated reanimation strategy where the targets of choice come with enter triggers that make them worth flickering. Scourge of Capitalism comes to mind. The 8/8 for 8 with Trample that fights an opposing creature and spills excess to the opponent's face has been desperate for a good reanimation spell to make it really hit hard. And this might be the opportunity it's been waiting for. Our final white card of the review is another big control finisher creature in priority inversion. It is a legendary 5/6 error for 3 and triple white that prevents you from losing the game and your opponents from winning the game until the end of your next turn whenever it enters or attacks. Further, priority inversion allows you to gain or lose life equal to the damage it deals, and automatically wins you the game at your upkeep if you have 0 or less life. Ultimately, I think priority inversion is a tad too awkward to really shine unless you're specifically dead on board to passive triggers from your opponent, and said opponent has no way of clearing this creature before your turn or keeping it from attacking the turn prior to your win. It's a lot of exciting text that ultimately just equates to it being a 5/6 lifelinker for 6, which does not really hold my excitement, even if I think the design is cool. We are now on to blue cards. Same structure as before. Cycling cards in ascending quality, then the rest in ascending mana value. Our first cycling card in blue is an unfortunate resident at the bottom of my rankings, the God Tree Chimes. It feels exciting to read on the surface. For 2 and a blue to cast, it's a legendary enchantment that draws you a card whenever you cycle a card, and if you already have one in play, you can pay that same cost to instead cycle it and copy a triggered ability you control in the process. I like that multiple copies can be stacked favorably for the draw trigger from one in play, hitting the stack at the same time as the copy effect to see it and target it, meaning that cycling additional copies draw you 3 cards for 3 mana if you organize your stack the right way. It's also worth noting that we have very little in the way of ability copying previously available in the field, so this does help to fill a niche. All of that being said, this is a really clunky card, with 3 mana being the major breakpoint for far more important cards currently available in the format, making it hard to justify running this out instead. The additional draw off of cycling cards could make it relevant with 1 mana cycling costs, but I feel like that falls into the win more category, where you're spending 3 mana to make already decent cards a little better, rather than making your plan to keep you alive or to interact with your opponent in any capacity. Also, as we'll get into it in a little bit, it's not the only way we're gaining to copy triggered abilities, so even in that regard, it doesn't inspire confidence. Up next is a canon reprint in Ominous Seas, which casts or cycles for 2 mana and gains 4 shadow counters as you draw cards, spending 8 counters to make an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token. Now, obviously, this is very similar to Tide's Ire, which we've had in the format for almost its full 2 years now, and Ire has gotten to put in a bit of work alongside big cost-reducing creatures, so there are things to like here. Seas gives slower decks a convenient means of applying pressure, turning card draw into an inevitable body on the board that puts the opponent under fire really quickly once it comes down. I also can't help but wonder if this could help one of my favorite cliques of Nylon commons, Pinnacle of Progress, see more serious play, as that permanent comes passively. That permanent cares about you passively accruing counters on your other permanents to make your Pinnacle come down for only 2 mana. Also worth noting, Ominous Seas is entering the field along with some 1 mana cycling costs, both things in the new set and also just delay stones, which means it is a meaningful win condition in those strategies. While it's generally a very chaotic format, one of the biggest things I've taken away from the Planechase Grand Prix this month is that 3 mana clone effects have some pretty great targets right now. With that in mind, Avatar's Whim has caught my interest. It's a 2 and a blue sorcery with island cycling for a 2, and if cast, it creates a token copy of a creature you control, except the creature's power and toughness are set to the total number of current islands you control plus the number of cycling cards in your graveyard. In terms of the big splashy rare cycling payoffs, it's probably one of the least exciting, but as a card on its own, it does provide a more easily cast clone effect that can be used to fix mana in a pinch. I think there's this weird dichotomy between Whim and Chronicle, where Chronicle is more restrictive to cast but more flexibly used, whereas Whim is easier to cast and can fix your mana if needed, but is more precise in its core function. I could see Whim doing some fun things, especially in my beloved Bant Golems, where it's a clone you can grab with Contest Coordinator, but I don't see it being a competitive staple by any measure. In a twist of fate, the common cycling cards in blue are actually the stronger of the suite in my opinion. First of the 2 that we have is Elope, a sorcery speed variant to This Town Ain't Big Enough, which has been wreaking havoc on official standard over the last few months. Much like an official standard, we have a strong host of enchantments worth picking up to repeat, including a few as low as 1 mana. The cycling cost here is also nice to help you pitch it when it's not important, but the one big hit here is that it's a sorcery, so you'll need to be more intentional with when you plan to use this. Don't underrate Elope, though. These kinds of effects have proven their worth in constructed environments like Revolution. You might be confused to see a 1 mana 1/1 here as the best of the blue cycling cards, but I think Veiled Branch Stalker is one of the most important cards in the incoming sets, thanks to just how perfectly it plays with ninjutsu. As mentioned, it's a 1/1 for 1 with cycling too, but it's got flying as well as an enter trigger to draw a card if a non-token creature you controlled left play without dying, which is accomplished by any ninjutsu card. This plays especially nicely thanks to how it runs alongside Charming Siren, a similarly great to bounce 1/1 flyer for 1 that stun locks opposing creatures if it leaves when not blocking. Together, these cards form the basis for any deck that's looking to lean on ninjutsu effects, and since both have late-game utility between Siren being hardcast as Left to the Sea and Branchstalker cycling to find a better card, they're even decent top decks. If ninjas have any shot at being competitive, Branchstalker will be a massive contributor to their success. All right, cycling cards might be done, but we aren't done with the cantrips quite yet. Parth is an exciting cantrip to get right now, though it can be awkward on the opening turns of the game. For 1 mana as a sorcery, you always draw a card, but then if you control a permanent with mana value 2 or greater, you also surveil 2. From turn 3 onwards, this represents an improved version of Serum Visions out of official Magic, especially when supplemented by the strong suite of control enchantments available from the Omens and Banishing Lights seeing play at the moment. Even beyond these, there are a lot of decks that are looking for serviceable cantrips, and this one's got a solid ceiling with a pretty minuscule hoop to jump through. I'm a fan. Heirs in the Weft also brings us a piece of 1 mana stack interaction, countering a creature spell with toughness 1 or less. This feels akin to the oft-played Twilight Ambush from its time in the field, though requiring failure to be held up on the stack puts more pressure on you holding denotation failure to deal with the card in question. The other big hit to denotation failure is that because it only checks toughness, it misses a startling number of cards that are shaping the texture of the format, from Kaineos to Contest Coordinator, Data Weaver to Electes, and from a Surface Reborn Lily to Urban Explorer. Low power, higher toughness creatures are having their day in Revolution right now, and denotation's inability to deal with them meaningfully makes me less confident in its place in the field. That said, denotation failure isn't our only 1 mana stack interaction piece we're gaining this rotation. Pass Judgment is X and a blue to counter a spell unless its controller pays X, with the key rider that it costs 1 less to cast for each tapped creature you control. We have 2 similar counterspells in the field right now that would beat Pass Judgment at a baseline, with Swelling Terror making a massive token if the opponent can pay the tax, and Brewing Storm having bounce flexibility as well as the means to do multiple things if you have weather in play. With that cost reduction clause, however, Pass Judgment becomes a critical component to Tempo's resurgence in Revolution. After a tough run in January saw the deck's key cards get hit, and it never really recovered after February's patch. 1 mana to quench or mana leak an opposing spell is already a huge swing for Tempo, and it plays very well with Tempo-friendly strategies like Ninjutsu. Keep your eyes out for this one. I suspect we'll be seeing it for many months to come. We do actually also have another 1/1 flyer for 1 joining the format in Ascended Salamander, who also comes with a flow ability to mill a player for 3 cards by paying 3 and a blue, though usually less since you can tap this and other creatures for its flow ability. While we do have some mill support tools still kicking, like the Black Laystone, I'm much more interested in its application for self-mill strategies, alongside other evasive 1-drops that can fill your graveyard, and support engines like Scrapyard Mecha and Cheddar and Gargantua along the way. Longtime viewers will remember my love for the Gargantua deck of Nyland's first Grand Prix, so anything that could play into those synergies always catches my attention in some capacity. Next up is Jump, which is one of my favorite subroutines we're getting next month. For a single blue mana, this subroutine flickers another creature or enchantment when it runs, though the chosen target doesn't come back until your next end step. At a baseline, this is a slow repeating flicker that can spam enter triggers from all of the best creatures and enchantments you know and may or may not love in the field, from generic use like the usual Kaineos, Coordinator, Omens, etc., to specific synergies like using this to flicker your Titans if you need them, if you need to, and even having niche usage with underplayed tools like Hostage Negotiation. The other functionality here is that Jump can flicker opposing permanents too, taking a blocking creature out of play to help you get in, or blinking a Banishing Light to temporarily rebuy the card you lost, or even blinking an opposing token to just take it out of play for good. Whether you're putting it in your next program to get the flicker next turn, or delaying it to set up flicker targets afterwards, Jump seems primed to create some exciting turns and cause trouble for your opponent. Just jump responsibly. If you're really going to be casting it and then flashing an Ominous Slaughter on your next upkeep so it's in play for the run trigger, I think you're going to make a couple enemies. Expert Blade Work is a bit hard to talk about on its own without showing the other ninjutsu cards we have, at least on the surface. It's a single blue instant that draws card and makes your next ninjutsu ability cost 1 less to activate this turn, but I think the reality here is that Expert Blade Work is really underwhelming. The cantrip is always available, so if you want a 1 mana instant speed cantrip, it does do that, but the ninjutsu discount only really serves to make it so the mana spent on Expert Blade Work doesn't actively hinder your ability to use ninjutsu too much. That being said, some of the better ninjutsu cards also just don't have generic mana in their ability cost, which means the bigger cards worth playing don't really get a benefit from Expert Blade Work after all. And the ones that do, you're not actually ramping your ninjutsu cost, you're just supplementing one of that generic mana for a blue to cycle this Expert Blade Work. There's another card we'll get into in the second video that does this passively as a permanent in green for 1 mana, and I'll have a lot better things to say about that, but for expert blade work, I don't think too much of it. Speaking of cards that ninjutsu for 1 mana and have no generic mana in their ninjutsu cost, here's Daring Shinobi. For 1 and a blue, you get a 2/1 Fox Ninja with ninjutsu for a single blue, of course, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you can draw a card, discarding a card if it didn't enter this turn. This is a solid follow-up to either of the 1 mana flyers, whether you're hitting for 2 and cantripping while stunning an opposing creature, or getting to redeploy a Branchwalker to draw an extra card. Not only does this curve seem like a solid start for any blue tempo plan, these are all commons, meaning that Pauper is getting a scary boost to blue tempo if and when we return to that format. Speaking of Pauper, Glitchland Sentinel engages in a tried and tested REV Pauper strategy, using cards like Cliffwalker to recast your permanents over and over. Sentinel is a 2/1 for 2 with Flash that allows you to cast up to 1 other permanent you control on enter. I'm not sure the strategy is generally conducive to the power level of current rotation, but Cliffwalker is still legal in the format for another 8 months, and the Cliffwalker deck got 2nd place in the 1 Pauper GP we've had so far, so there could be something worth trying here. Reclusive Percipient has me kind of torn, as I can't decide if this card is bad or amazing. It's a 1/3 for 2 mana, and it can tap and discard a card to create a blue subroutine token that draws you a card when it runs, though you can only make those tokens at sorcery speed. There are some token shenanigans for gaining this rotation that I'll get into in more detail when we get to the multicolor section next video, but even with the sets currently in the field, it's a free non-mana ability for things like Seal Shoals and a phenomenal target for Mimicry Elemental. And while you don't get the card replaced immediately, the subroutine threatens to offer more than 1 card worth of draw even just by itself. As you pile up those tokens, the card advantage it offers can help to bury your opponent. The discard and repeat refill here can be nice for strategies like Chitter and Gargantua decks, or help refuel things with or help fuel things with like Eyes of the Bureau. Percipient could be worth experimenting with. Architect of the Intangible has inspired some excitement as a 2/1 for double blue that mills you for 3 before letting you cast a copy of an instant, sorcery, or subroutine out of your graveyard, cashing it if you choose not to cast it immediately. I've seen folks float the idea of using it to loop a loop to keep bouncing your opponent's permanents, but that loop requires 6 total mana to perform, since the only way to return a loop to your graveyard is to let it get cached. That said, I think the fairer use of Architect is just letting you replay an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. It can be really strong with the right spells to recast. Even at a baseline, though, it's able to bank a utility spell, so that's pretty appealing. And whether that's leaving a counterspell face up to psych out your opponent, or casting a copy of a subroutine to get into token shenanigans, or even just rebuying a Parse, since this corrupts Parse. It's not the most competitively potent card by any means, but it's perfectly playable. Even contributes 2 devotion to your Agent of Deception, and can be gotten off of Ozan's Blessing. Yokinzen Pathfinder is, in my mind, a core component of the ninja strategy. It's a 2 mana 1/3 that makes one of your attacking creatures unblockable, forcing it back to your hand at end of combat. 3 important things to note here. First, it helps you slip your smaller ninjas through once they're no longer able to safely attack, especially if your flying creatures can't otherwise slip through the board. Framing things in my brain, I'm not entirely sure where I was going with that particular thought. It allows you to slip your smaller ninjas through, especially if your opponent only has creatures on the ground, so your flying creatures could get in, but you have no ninjutsu creatures in hand. Secondly, this helps you rebuy enter and leave triggers, meaning that even without a ninja in hand, you can generate value with your 1-drops. And third, because this returns the creature at end of combat, and attacking creatures are still considered attacking at end of combat, you can use this to slip a larger ninja through for damage, pick it up, and then use their ninjutsu ability after damage to replay them immediately if desired. Even outside of those cases, this can just be good to help rebuy strong enter triggers like Agent of Deception while chipping in for more damage, or helping slip in a creature that might not otherwise get to attack that you want to ninjutsu away anyways. You don't even need to have the Pathfinder target one of your attacking creatures if you'd rather rebuy something that's summoning sick. It's a stellar component to the ninja strategy and is worth some serious consideration and respect. In case you're curious as to why I'd rate the God Tree Chime so low, here's a big part of why. Maiden of the Waters is a 1/4 for 2 mana that has flow for 3 and a blue to copy a triggered ability you control. At a baseline, Maiden solves the problem that Chimes has in that it This can meaningfully contribute to your board state, and it actively incentivizes you to build up your board more to afford more activations of her flow ability. Because her flow ability can be activated repeatedly, she's sneakily also just good with activated ability synergies, such as using her in response to your Seal Shoal's trigger to help meet the Shoal's requirement and get more tokens out of the equation. It is worth noting that abilities that trigger only once each turn aren't good to copy, as they check that condition on resolution and can fail, so do be wary of what you pair Maiden with. That said, Shoals could always use a way of helping to make it spin out of control, so I like Maiden in that situation. Omen of Deception has been the format's big 2-mana stack interaction option of choice for much of its tenure, even now as we head into its final season in rotation, but even if it doesn't get supplanted now, I suspect Deft Deflection will help to fill the void it leaves behind in September. Deft Deflection is 1 in a blue for an instant that allows you to choose between countering a spell or an activated or triggered ability from a non-land source, unless that spell or ability's controller pays 2. This is some great utility, allowing your key interaction spell to have a broader range of coverage and help fight cycling and other discard abilities that otherwise circumvent counterspells. Whether you're using it as a quench or punishing an activated ability that required the player to discard, or even just using it to disable a detrimental trigger from your own cards, Deft Deflection will have a role in the format for the foreseeable future. Negate is back! This is a classic sideboard tool, countering a non-creature spell for 2 mana, and we haven't had it since Svergard rotated out of the format exactly 2 years ago as of this coming May. It'll be nice to have Negate back, whether you're a control deck using it for the mirror, or a tempo deck looking to have hard answers to planeswalkers and enchantments on the stack. Task Triage is likely to garner comparisons to Seafloor Treasures, what with them both being 2-mana instants that get you one of the top 2 cards of your deck to your hand. But where Seafloor Treasures puts the other into your graveyard and can be recast later on, Triage lets you cache the card you don't take, being able to play it later on if you pay the cost to crack open the memory token. Overall, the mana cost required to get 2 cards from Task Triage is actually 1 less than mana required for Seafloor Treasures. Now, the mana spent on the back half of Triage must be used at the same time as you choose to play the cached card, whereas Seafloor Treasures can just get a card to your hand for a later turn. I think Triage won't outright replace Treasures, but it's an interesting side grade, especially since the hidden information of the cache lets you conceal information about what card you're protecting. Sure, your opponent can use enchant removal to deny you the second card, but the same is true of Graveyard Hate to Seafloor Treasures and Hand Attack against any card draw, and all 3 of those categories of interaction are getting support this rotation, so I think overall, Triage is at least worth giving a shot if you want Treasures but don't care for your graveyard that much. In case you thought Jump was the only enchantment flicker we were getting in blue, meet Soul Space Refit, which for 2 mana can flicker any creature or enchantment before returning it to play, and then caching the top card of your library. This does the same baseline interactions as Jump, from removing tokens to rebuying your enter triggers, just without keeping them out of play for the full turn, but there are 2 areas where the instant speed timing here can be stronger. The first case is with Omen and Agent of Deception, which both appreciate instant speed flickers to reuse their enter triggers and turn this flicker spell into a stack interaction. The second case is with Oracle of Zakros and Ocular Insight. Any creature with a blessing can be cast for their aura, and upon being flickered, they return to play as their creature half. This makes it so you can cast Ocular Insight on one of your creatures for 1 mana, flicker it with Refit for 2, and get a 3-mana Oracle of Zakros before attacks, where you can then get an Oracle trigger to bless one of your creatures anyhow and start the card advantage train rolling. While the blessing line can be taken with Jump, the fixed timing there makes it hard to reliably keep the blessing in play in time to get the flicker, whereas Soul Space Refit provides immediacy. This interaction has been a proven winner in past seasons since Age of Trax's rotation into the format, and between Refit and our pre-existing White Flicker from Chikyu Chaos Reigns, Oracle Scam may get a real comeback in its final season. Data Staff is kind of an awkward artifact, entering tapped and adding mana only for subroutine spells, as well as being able to be tapped to draw a card for 4 mana, though it will cost 1 less to use for each subroutine of yours that ran during the turn you use it to draw. I'll talk about these cards in more detail later, but there are 2 big subroutines I see being useful for in terms of getting them down the turn after you play Data Staff, with Reset, shuffling your hand and graveyard into your deck before drawing you 7 cards, and Panic, letting you pitch a card from your hand to damage a creature or planeswalker equal to the discarded card's mana value, and then making 4/4s with Menace each time it runs. I don't think Reset is all that good in our new environment, and while Panic does seem good, I don't think you need Data Staff to make it good by any measure, though getting the 4/4 token as part of starting your 4th turn does seem nice. Ultimately, I think the only real cause for excitement around Data Staff is going to be for decks assembling a critical mass of subroutine tokens, using that final ability as a free card draw when those tokens all fire off. However, if you want Data Staff to draw you a card each turn for free, you need 12 subroutines in play, and which in the case of the blue tokens, those draw you cards anyways, so Data Staff doesn't even really seem necessary there. Ultimately, I think this is just a miss for me, but it warranted at least a little bit of discussion. Next, we have Just-in-Time Interpreter, which is a 2/3 for 2 and a blue that caches the top card of your deck and makes your memories cost 1 less to activate. It's actually a really nice card in multiples, reducing the memory tax to 0 so you can crack them open without any hindrance to your mana. And the fact that it yields you a memory token on enter further enhances its value. Honestly, this seems like a solid value use for Extraction Mission if you want to push Mission towards a value tool. If you can pay red mana to spend 4 and get 2 Just-in-Time Interpreters, then you can crack a memory for free and immediately get that value. And considering it's in blue, you can even aim to use blue mana for Mission to flash it in on your opponent's turn, so you can cache the top 2 cards of your deck before you untap to free up all of your mana for the cards you cached away. I don't think that line's going to be format shaking, but there are neat applications to be had with the Interpreter that make it better than it might look at first glance. Soul Space Access feels very reminiscent of Threads of Disloyalty from canon, enchanting a creature with power 2 or less and giving you control of that creature for as long as it is enchanted. You've heard me ring the bell and again on how good Kaineos is right now, and you'll keep hearing me say it. And Soul Space is not an awful way to check Kaineos, but yeah, your opponent gets a card from Kaineos and enter, but if they don't remove their own Kaineos, you get to start using their own value engine against them. To make matters worse, this is findable off your own Kaineos, as well as being a valid hit off of Revolt at the Palace, but it probably isn't good enough to make huge waves. I don't know, we'll have to see. Soul Space Access does some sweet things in our current environment, but it's hard to say for sure if it'll be, like, really truly getting up there. Take a moment to pause the video. I will be back in just a moment. I need to drink some water. I can feel the strain on my voice already. All right, refresh break and voice resting break over. Let's get back into it with Unending Possibility, which is kind of a hard enchantment to evaluate on the surface. It enters for 3 mana, allowing you to cache any number of cards from your hand face down, and then lets you copy cast spells you cast for no additional tax beyond the cost to sacrifice your memory tokens. There are some great things to like about this, but also some things that make it look kind of awful. As Cryptolab has shown us, being able to protect your hand from hand attack spells can be pretty valuable on its own, but with Cryptolab and similar cards both paying for and the memory ability and the spell that's exiled, there could be something to do with Unending Possibility doubling up your spells in a ramp strategy. That being said, with enchantment removal being at such a premium right now and a core mechanic of one of the new sets hinging on enchantment token activation, disestablishmentarianism is likely to see a lot more play, which threatens to shut down any effects you have to cache cards from your hand, and making the copy effective possibility useless. The fun parts here intrigue me, but I fear it may never have a fully friendly environment that lets it shine. I've said it before, but I've been liking clone effects more and more as of late, and Copy couldn't be more honest about what it's up to in that regard. For 2 and a blue, this subroutine creates a token copy of a creature you control whenever it runs, serving as a delayed clone effect that repeats every 3 turns thereafter. It's not remarkable in a vacuum, but the Titans are amazing permanents to copy up, whether you're playing this after a Titan to bank the copy effect, or storing it further down your programs ahead of one of your Titans. There are probably better token copy effects to be playing, but this is a sweet one, and I want to try it at least once. If you thought the case against the Godtree Chimes wasn't bad enough, we also have Composer of Skylines, a 2/4 artifact creature construct advisor for 2 and a blue that has level up for 2 and a blue. From levels 1 to 2, it's a 3/5 that doubles up your triggered abilities passively, and from level 3 onwards, it's a 4/6 that triples your triggers. I can't confidently say this will outshine Maiden of Waters, as Maiden could theoretically be activated more than 2 times to spam an ability, but Composer is the more reasonable card to lean on because the mana tax is 1 time only. Composer also has other synergies, such as being a pretty reasonable target for Avatar Exchange later on, albeit not one that is particularly safe to do so with, or having its level up help to enable Seal Shoals and then cause Shoals to make multiple tokens. Really though, I think the biggest source of excitement for me here is Composer synergy with ability cost reducers. Ballot Registrar has struggled to see much play since it stopped affecting lands back in October of last year, but between level up, memory tokens, flow, ninjutsu, and not so much cycling and ninjutsu. I wrote that before I remembered that it says permanence, but between memory tokens, level up, and flow, there is a ton to like about its cost reduction right now, especially if you can get 2 in play to significantly reduce the hurt on Composer's level up cost. Composer looks even better in Returnal, where a single copy of Rallying the Revolutionaries reduces its activation down to a single blue to level it up. This might be a clunky card on the surface, but the Construct Advisor does have a lot to offer in the right scenarios. Next, let's knock out a pair of blue ninjas at 3 mana, both humans that cast for 2 and a blue, though their ninjutsu costs do differ. Twilight Agent is a 2/2 that can be ninjutsu'd in for 1 and a blue and has a passive trigger to draw you a card whenever 1 or more other creatures you control leave without dying. Moonblade Ninja is a 3/1 whose ninjutsu cost mirrors the casting cost and can return another target creature you control to its owner's hand on enter. I don't think either is a huge gain for ninjutsu strategies, but I could see Twilight Agent getting some experimentation and proving me wrong. It's got more going for it than Moonblade Ninja, at least, who seems primarily like a limited card. But ultimately, it's worth knowing the full field of ninjutsu cards to some degree, so don't let Moonblade slip your mind completely, but don't count on it being integral, as the trigger relying on other creatures you control leaving is really awkward when this picks something up before it hits play. So, kind of rough there. There is a third ninja at 2 and a blue, but this one is not really caring about its ninjutsu cost too much. Notori Skyblade is a 2/2 bird ninja with flying and ninjutsu for 3 and double blue, but that high ability cost is justified primarily by its combat damage trigger, drawing you a card when it hits a player or planeswalker, and then copying itself if it entered this turn. Now, the primary appeal here is supposed to be to get a pair of 2/2 flyers that draw cards for 5 mana on the ninjutsu cost, but all of that gets circumvented by a single Disaster Cat. Calamity Cat on turn 1 or 2 allows you to give a turn 3 Notori Skyblade haste as well as a +1/+1 counter, meaning you connect for 3 damage the turn you play it, and get the token without needing to pay that ninjutsu cost. Skyblade also has great synergy with tapped and attacking token copies, such as the ones made off of Rain Dance, allowing you to spiral your board of 2/2 flyers out of control turn by turn, in conjunction with drawing a ton of cards for your trouble. Skyblade seems like a great mid-range tool to apply pressure while keeping card count high. It just depends on you getting that initial hit to get the ball rolling. River Guardian is pretty unimpressive at a glance, but there is a legacy of similar cards seeing some serious play. It's a 2/1 dragon with flying for 2 and a blue, and it passively gives your other flying creatures +1/+1. The reason its base stat line is so low is because it has an enter trigger, allowing you to pay 3 and a blue to make a pair of 1/1 flying birds as an army in a can. That being said, that enter trigger is almost useless in most scenarios for constructed, but the base anthem could be good in the right situations. Nitrous Elemental, which rotated at the start of the year, was a major component of tempo strategies for a long time, though that was owed in part to its lower cost and it having flash, both areas in which River Guardian fails to live up. Screeching Grauku has also seen play as a small flying anthem for your base power 1 creatures, but that too has some clear advantages over River Guardian. There is currently certainly no shortage of 1 and 2 mana flyers, but only time will tell if that makes this actually worth playing. Confronting Time's Jailer is Blue's Time Loop Saga, casting for 2 and a blue and phasing out another target non-land permanent on its second chapter, drawing you 2 cards on its second and creating a Time Bubble enchantment token that taxes your spells on its third. The clear intent here is that this is a repeatable draw to for 3 mana, but if you don't get rid of the time bubbles, they will gradually tax you out of casting your spells reliably. The draw being on chapter 2 here is also awkward, as it buys your opponent time to pick it off without actually letting you get any value for your trouble. And the phasing out is also really clunky, because whatever you target phases in before its controller's untap step, meaning you can't meaningfully disrupt opposing permanents, and it doesn't really stop your own detrimental upkeep triggers, meaning the phasing only really serves to temporarily get rid of a time bubble, or I guess remove a blocker for a turn. The big appeal here for many players is that the right sacrifice outlets can turn this card's big drawback into an upside. Feed it to your General Diadem for a night token, to your Ozonwood Huntsman to buff it up, to your Glassblowers Forge to draw another card, or to assure destruction as you pick off a few choice permanents. That's not to mention that we're getting a whole host of new cards capable of popping your bubbles. I think Confronting Time's Jailer is ultimately the second weakest of the Time Loop sagas, but there are still things to like about it at least. Threadweaver Shinobi is our final ninjutsu card in mono blue, casting for 3 in a blue and sneaking in for 1 in a blue as a 3/2 human ninja. Rather than an inherent trigger, Threadweaver has a static ability that modifies card draw outside of the normal one you get for your turns, drawing you 2 cards instead. I'm not sure this will be worth gemming a bunch of copies into ninjas, but I could see it doing some work there to good effect. Even beyond that, this is another card that dances on the grave of the God Tree Chimes, drawing you extra cards for your cycling activations while representing a body on the board. In the current environment, enchantments just feel so risky to commit to if they don't actively progress your board state or hinder your opponents or generate some serious value. So while the dies to removal argument is always true for creatures, enchantments like the God Tree Chimes feel even more under scrutiny as of late. Preemption Daemon is a 2/2 flash flying enchantment creature bird for 2 and double blue, which exiles a spell or non-land permanent on enter. The card's controller can replay the exiled card, but they have to pay 3 instead of the usual cost. This feels kind of reminiscent of something like Gentle Grasp, delaying the spell for a moment, but not truly handling the problem long term. I like that Preemption Daemon can hit things in play, a rare trait for blue stack interaction, but fixing the spell's cost to 3 means you don't really tax them for much, and for larger permanents you might want to remove, you actually just let them get it back for cheaper than it would normally cost to cast, so it could be worse than just a bounce effect. It can be nasty for it to flicker, but not so nasty that I'd call it powerful, especially for the base cost of Preemption Daemon being so high. All right, we've talked about this with the Funky Mana Rock earlier, but let's give Reset some proper explaining. I mentioned before that I don't think too highly of Reset, and I think a lot of that comes down to how awkward it is as a universal effect. For 2 and double blue, you get a subroutine that runs to let each player choose to shuffle their hand and graveyard into their deck to draw 7 cards. Not only do you have to put this draw 7 on layaway, meaning your opponent has time to remove it, any faster deck that can also see this hit play and decide to run as many cards out from their hand as possible, causing them to weaponize your draw engine better than you feasibly could, having spent your previous turn just playing it. If you don't set it to run as soon as possible, that gives you more time to plan around it better, but your opponent gets more time to leverage too. Reset is appealing on the surface, but the delay and the 4 mana spent to help your opponent more than it can help you ultimately really hurt what it's trying to do. Lorana Loop's End is a pretty spicy card. For 3 and double blue, they're a 12/12 legendary avatar that enters tapped with 12 stun counters on them. When they enter, they let you cast spells as though they have flash until your next turn. And they also statically untap your permanents during each other player's untap step. There are fun things this can do with allowing you to double the amount of mana you have to functionally interact with your opponent, but the big spice here is Axiomatic Shift, which can be flashed out thanks to Lorana's enter trigger and can rip every last stun counter off of them to slam any big creature you could possibly want from your deck. I'm not sure if the Axiomatic Shift plan could be very good, especially if you're using it to tempt you into playing big clunky creatures, but even at a baseline, Lorana's mana generation and defensiveness by untapping your creatures and lands is pretty interesting. If you ever get Revolution Commander, this thing will be a house, but in 1v1 constructed, it's probably more of a meme. Convil Archive Exec is no meme, though. For 1 and quadruple blue, this 5/5 legendary Spirit Wizard has flash and an enter and attack trigger to draw cards for each mana value among your permanents from 1 to 4. I don't think Convil will almost ever be drawing you the full 4 cards, but I don't think you need it to. Even just drawing 1 or 2 is a solid bit of value stapled onto a flash body, made better by the fact that that draw is repeatable as you attack with them. It's a sweet top-end threat for control to help refuel after running low on gas, though it is made awkward by how many of the better control tools are in white right now and encourage you to be pretty heavy on white. Convil is still feasibly castable, but if you're trying to go in on Fall of Elantin as well, your mana base is really going to need to be perfect. Signal Inversion is the next of the inversion cycle, 3 and triple blue for a -8/6 legendary error. They give your opponent's creatures -1 power and mill your opponent for 0 cards minus their power on attack. It's a double negative, so they mill 8 at the baseline. The final ability is the only one that's kind of exciting, permanently stealing opposing creatures with 0 or less power. Signal Inversion will be able to steal opposing copies of Kaineos and Contest Coordinator to clear them from blocking, which is nice, but otherwise it's kind of just an awkward body for 6 mana. I don't believe this can ever kill what it gets blocked by in combat, since you aren't really dealing damage with that -8 power. It's a neat card, but kind of mediocre. Cybersaurus is the first in a few cards we'll be talking about across these two parts, with Dark Horse Victory in mind. It's a 7/9 enchantment dinosaur for 5 and double blue that gets Ward 3, but the big reason to care here is that you could discard it for 2 and a blue to counter a spell with mana value 4 or less. The 3 mana discard sets it up to be brought back turn 4 with Dark Horse Victory, thanks to that discard being an activated ability. It's honestly not a great card to use with DHV on its own, but Underflow Error helps be a bit more reliable. Underflow Error is a 9/8 error skeleton for 6 and double blue, though once again, we won't be hard casting it most times. It taps an opposing creature during each opponent's upkeep and discards for 1 and a blue to tap a creature and draw a card. Underflow Error is a pretty nasty clock to get back off of Dark Horse Victory, especially considering it can stem aggression from with the discard and hold down blockers once it's ready to swing. We'll revisit Dark Horse Victory down the road with some big cycling creatures in part 2, but just keep this thing in mind with reanimation effects in general. Sakura Dance is a wildly hard permanent to get into play, but I feel like doing so could be incredible value in the right circumstances. It's 6 and a double blue for an enchantment that lets you copy any non-land cards you discard and cast the copies without paying their mana costs. 8 mana is really hard to swing, but the value on offer here is really exciting to me. It's meme deck material for sure, but I can't help but want to jam GPs with this thing and find an avenue to reliably win with it. Last for our blue cards is Undefined Behavior, a 7 blue 10/11 flying error sphinx that copies non-error permanents, one of each permanent type among permanents you control on enter. There's really only one reason I feel obligated to share this with you, and it's a public service announcement that you should give Primordial Seas a try. A community member named Magma Dragon has been jamming a Swablu Seas deck for a couple months now that looks to reduce Primordial Seas' cost and get copies of it for infinite token copies of all of your permanents. And it's right on the cusp of competitive success. Magma made top 8 with the strategy in March after going 3 and 2 with the deck in February. Take their deck for a spin and ask them about ways to improve the strategy. And as far as Undefined Behavior goes, it's not great. Very costly, very awkward. Maybe you could reanimate it. Maybe you could try playing it with bulk bioengineering, but I'm not hopeful for this one. New color, same basic process. Let's talk about cycling cards first, starting with Midnight Duo. It's 4 and a black for 3/2 human samurai that cycles for 2, and when it enters, you make a 2/2 white samurai with Exalted. This is a limited card that does not really see constructed playable at all, so let's just move on. Wicked Manifestation could have something interesting going for it. It's a 1/1 horror for 1 and a black, and cycles for 2. Manifestation passively gets +1/+1 for each card with a cycling ability in your graveyard, opening the door for an interesting threat provided you have enough cycling cards in your bin. I don't think Manifestation will see too much play though. We've seen similar high stat 2-drops like Chromagoyf kind of struggle due to their stat lines being dependent on external components. And with so much attention on graveyards right now, things like Soul Guide Lantern are sure to ruin your day with Manifestation. That being said, some of the best graveyard hate we're gaining with these two sets aren't exile-based, so perhaps once Lantern rotates in September, that could be a stealth buff to this Manifestation's lethality. Next is Ruiner's Hijacking, which casts for 4 and a black to reanimate a creature from any graveyard, or cycles for 1 and a black to mill a player for 3. Worth noting, the cycle trigger here will resolve before the draw, so if you mill yourself, make sure you do that before you draw. Otherwise, this card seems fine. We've been really starved for playable reanimation effects that can go big, since our best option in Extraction Mission was taken down to only bringing back small targets in Nyland's inaugural patch, and now costs a lot of mana to slip something big into play. Speaking of Nyland, I brought it up earlier with our white reanimation spell, but I really think a bundle of reanimation spells we're getting are a good boon for Scourge of Capitalism. It's a solid body with a Haymaker of an enter trigger, and if you're looking to lock in Ruiner's Hijacking, you'll be hard-pressed to find a better reanimation target, though both of these sets are bringing some interesting contenders to fight Scourge of Capitalism for that slot. And with the cycling package I mentioned, you could also just play Dark Horse Victory, Cycling Reanimator, and cycle some pretty mediocre, big, common creatures, and get value that way. Damn to Hell is our last cycling card in mono black, coming with Swamp Cycling for 2 and casting for 4 and a black. It's an instant that deals damage split as you please among creatures and planeswalkers, totaling the number of swamps you control and cycling cards in your graveyard, while also gaining you that much life. This pulls into two very different directions between black-based control and a dedicated cycling strategy. I think the black-based control plans put this to better use. It's easier for them to get to hold up 5 mana more reliably, it's easier for them to want to hold up mana for interaction, and the life gain is more relevant for slower decks that need tools like this to help them stabilize. The cycling deck could also leverage this to recover after spending the early turns digging through the deck and ignoring the board, but I'm not sure it's great if you're all in on cycling. The ultimate reality, in my opinion, is that its best home will lie somewhere in the middle, relying on cycling cards like the White Laystone and the White Removal enchantments, as well as building up a mana base of swamps and plains to work towards improving their rare land cyclers. White-Black Control's about to have a new instant speed semi-sweeper in their arsenal, and they won't have to lean on a bunch of white sources to necessarily have to play Fall of Volantine. It's kind of cool. Moving on from cycling cards, I'd be a fool to not begin our general discussion of black cards in these sets with anything other than the fact that not one, but both sets are bringing Duress back to the field. We haven't had Duress in rotation since Secrets of the River Cities rotated back out in January of 2022, over 3 years ago. Duress is a key sideboard tool for black that we've had to rely on alternatives to for the past couple of years now. While there are drawbacks to it in the current environment, such as Weathers decks being able to acclimate any discarded Weathers back from their graveyard to their hand, flashback spells causing some trouble for Duress getting the most value, and plenty of graveyard strategies that you might be tired of by now, there's still so much to appreciate about having this simple tool back into the field. And the best part is, we have 2 arts to choose from, whether you have one you prefer or just want to use a mixture of both. Alright, next we have Omen Skulker, which feels like it's just begging for experimentation in decks aimed at competitive play. It is a 1/1 skeleton for a single black mana that deals 1 damage to your opponent and gains you 1 life whenever you cast a multicolored spell, as well as leaving a treasure behind when it dies. It feels like the unholy marriage of Diabolical Minion and Gilded Reaper, 2 cards from older rotations that had major sway over how decks could function and especially thrived together. There are 2 avenues of play where I think Omen Skulker can thrive, and both seem very appealing. The first major use case is that Omen Skulker is one of 3 1-drop creatures we have in the field as of this May that leave behind a treasure on death, with the others being Eidolon of Empty Thoughts and a red creature we'll get to in the next part of the review. These kinds of cards have been historically good alongside Deadly Dispute, a canon card we got added to the field back in September with Cliques of Nylon, but hasn't really made many waves as of yet, though it has seen some competitive play. Skulker helping to get to up the density of turn 1 creatures you can profitably sacrifice to Deadly Dispute to get true treasures, as well as causing issues for aggressive opponents looking to punch through your easy chump blockers, can be nice heading into a pretty unknown field. The other use case I can see being great with Skulker is in more aggressive or mid-rangey strategies, looking to lean on multicolored spells to maximize on that cast trigger. One bell I will keep ringing is that Scrapyard Mecha is a great draw engine that works well with self-mill and looting synergies, and both Mecha and its best support tool in Ignited Soul are multicolor. We've seen historically that Diabolical Minion works incredibly with aggressive tools to put pressure on your opponent, and removal that can throw the opponent off balance, so I could definitely see the stars aligning for Omen Skulker to put in some work. And even in Eternal, I think 5-color gold-black is getting to really thrive, because not only can you play Diabolical Minion and Gilded Reaper, but now Omen Skulker provides additional consistency to Diabolical Minion, and we always keep getting better Black X multicolor cards. Sludge Drudge is another spicy 1/1-for-1 rare creature out of Kitsuo, this time an Ooze Samurai with lifelink. When it or another creature you control enters, if it entered or was cast from a graveyard, you give that creature 2 exalted counters, potentially amassing a lot of stats all at once on your one attacker. This is another interesting option for the turbo graveyard filling strategies that Ignited Soul and company love so much, but it's hard to fully parse what the best tools with Drudge will be. Right now we've got Bind Life to Steal and the previously mentioned Dragon of Recollection as ways to bring multiple creatures back, the former of which can theoretically recur your entire graveyard, while the latter can bring back 3 mana value total of creatures. Either way, there is a potential for the Drudge to put a lot of exalted counters into play. Let's go down a hypothetical here. You cast Dragon of Recollection to bring back 2 copies of Sludge Drudge and a Calamity Cat. Each Drudge puts 4 Exalted counters on each of your 3 1-drops, each other and the cat, and then Calamity Cat can tap to give your dragon haste and a +1/+1 counter, making it a 3/3 that gets +12/+12 from your 3 4 counter Exalted counter 1-drops. It's not super reliable, but it's a 4-mana board refill that pushes 15 damage into the air immediately while leaving up some 1/1 lifelinkers that can either chump block, or if the dragon dies, you can just swing with a Sludge Drudge getting +12/+12 the following turn. It's pretty spicy, if not the most competitively viable per se. One of the decks that I feel is getting a bit of a push in Kitsuo is a more traditional type of Aristocrats build, and I can't quite decide if Blighted Mistress is meant to be a facet of that strategy in Constructed. It's another 1/1 for 1, this time a Demon Noble with lifelink. She's got she's got 2 sorcery speed activated abilities, letting you tap her for 2 mana and sacrifice a creature to make your opponent discard a card, or tap her for 3 and exile a creature card from your graveyard to draw a card and lose 1 life. We have a few interesting Aristocrat triggers available to us right now, from the sacrifice-specific option of Smiling Sludge to more generalized options like Kakamanti's Circle and Athrio's Gold-Eyed, and even weird fringe options like Gilded Death. I think one of the biggest components of Aristocrats that's going to need help to make it work is figuring out how to space out mana in such a way that you can get to progress your game plan without just getting yourself set up with a bunch of cards that do nothing on their own. Blighted Mistress can help with the getting things done half of the equation, but it's a lot of mana to activate, and ultimately I think that makes it harder to sell in those contexts when you could be spending that mana to help develop things you care about sacrificing. Speaking of things you care about sacrificing, we have one last 1/1 for 1, as Willing Acolyte is a human warlock that deals 2 damage to each of your opponents and gains you 2 life when it dies. It also has a 7-mana ability to drain your opponent for 3 from your graveyard, but we really only care about that first line of text. As far as things worth sacrificing go, Willing Acolyte is a pretty appealing option, and it seems like a perfect candidate for the Skofos Conqueror shells floating around back during Stasis Bot's Extraction Mission GP win back in November of last year, and the Mardu Yeji lists that popped up this past January. One of the best things about Skofos Conqueror and its partner in crime Barbarous Rough Rider is just how quickly they can pile damage up between their innate triggers and their bodies. And having a 1-drop that can contribute to both the sacrifice plan and the aggression in a meaningful way is a great boon for that kind of archetype. Also, one thing I'll note about Extraction Mission is because it is now an X-cost spell, it's actually more efficient if you're getting back 1-cost creatures. Paying a black and a red to return Willing Acolyte means you're getting 2 1/1s, one of which can attack immediately and sacrifices even if your opponent doesn't block it to push 2 more damage. And naturally, Conqueror and Barbarous Rough Rider want you to be playing Extraction Mission to get them back too. Next, we've got a pair of 1-mana removal spells courtesy of Errors in the Weft between Downlink Overload and Fall Forever. Both are instants, with Downlink giving a creature -2/2 and making its controller mill 2 cards, while Fall exiles a creature or planeswalker and surveils 2 for you. Though Fall Forever has a pretty important additional cost, requiring you to either take a level counter off of one of your creatures or pay 3. I think both of these are honestly fine. Overload's a nice anti-aggro tool with some small upsides if you care about putting cards into your opponent's graveyard, and Fall is a largely unremarkable 4-mana hard removal that poses as a 1-cost removal piece. I do think there are a couple level up cards that are worth considering for constructed play, but not to the degree that I think Fall Forever will be worth removing a level counter to make it 1 mana. In all honesty, I think the real truth of Fall Forever is that it's just a 4-mana analog to Out with the Old. It's easier to cast than the 1 in double black removal spell, and while it doesn't push damage, it gets Surveil 2, so it's more likely for control decks to want to get that Surveil 2 over the damage that Out with the Old provides, and might just want the more flexible casting cost at the cost of it coming down for 1 more mana. Sundering the Fleet is a single mana sorcery that draws you 2 cards at the cost of sacrificing an artifact or creature. This is Deadly Dispute for half the cost, but it doesn't leave a treasure behind, and it's sorcery speed only. The sorcery speed clause really hurts because it lacks the ability to blank removal like Dispute, but I could see it being worth consideration alongside Dispute to help supplement the other sacrifice tools and ratchet up your deck's ability to dig quickly. Much like with Dispute, it looks especially good off of a Devoted Lackeys, cashing in the 2/2 Death Toucher for 4 cards and only 3 mana, and thanks to the priority rules, you can completely avoid getting the Lackeys removed if you follow it up immediately with the Sundering the Fleet. It's not flashy, but it's a solid role player that I think will see reliable use. Next is a pretty innocent-looking subroutine, REV. It's our last 1-mana black card, surveilling 2 when you run it and letting you pay 2 mana and 2 life to crack it and draw 2 cards. In my mind, this is a solid self-mill tool that acts as a more insular equivalent to Finax's Touch, pushing cards to your graveyard instead of disrupting your opponent's hand and pulling double duty on the sacrifice ability. I've been a big fan of even just one-shot surveil effects in graveyard-centric strategies, and while it's not a perfect support tool for mecha, I'll definitely be trying it in those kinds of shells. We have arrived at last to the big Emperor Zuhan combo card, Moonlight Adversary. Adversary is a 2/1 Nightmare Noble for 1 and a black that passively drains your opponent for 1 whenever you discard a card. It also has an enter trigger letting you pay X life to return X target card you discarded this turn from your graveyard to your hand, which is the core of the combo. That's actually a lie. I miswrote that when I wrote this slide. It's not mana efficient by any measure, but casting Zuhan's Adventure by right for Wooburg lets you cycle for 1 life instead of paying mana costs, which opens the door for Moonlight Adversary to refund that life while applying pressure to the opponent. If you're in a pinch, you can even use Zuhan's main ability as well, flickering the adversary to use that enter trigger to rebuy cycled cards and keeping the chain alive, but that requires some serious pre-planning since Zuhan is 3 mana, by right is 5, and Moonlight Adversary is 2. All of this being said, there's another combo we'll get to later in this section of the review that I think puts Adversary to an even better use. Beyond combo potential, though, it's a nice cycling support tool, made awkward by the tension between its enter trigger wanting you to have already cycled cards and its passive ability wanting you to hold back cards you'd be inclined to discard. Though, if you pull back too many cards beyond your max hand size, Adversary can get a burst of damage as you discard down to 7 cards in hand. We in the business call this foreshadowing. Next up is Catabolist? I think? A 2-mana 3/1 vampire warlock that creates a subroutine when it dies, which drains your opponent for 1 when it runs and can be and has this secondary ability to return it from graveyard to play tapped for 2 mana if a card left your graveyard that turn. I adore this card. This subroutine feels far worse than just draining your opponent on death on the surface because of the delay, but obviously the longer the game goes, the more that damage gets to add up. I'm particularly enamored with that return ability, though, and just how perfectly it helps this creature slot into the exact graveyard nonsense shells you know I'm known to love. This kind of thing crews Scrapyard Mecha and uses Mecha's ability to eat cards in graveyard to allow you to slip it back out into play. It works well with tools like Garen, since his uptick can funnel cards into your graveyard, and his downticks can pull things out of your graveyard to tee up the activation. With enough sacrifices of this thing, you'll start hammering your opponent with life swings courtesy of the subroutine tokens, and with the right shell, you'll be able to keep ripping it out of your graveyard again and again. Is it a competitive all-star? Almost certainly not, but it is easily one of my favorite cards from Errors in the Weft. Existing in a similar vein, but inspiring a lot less excitement from me, is Fallen Heartseeker, a similarly statted 3/1 human samurai for 2. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, you can pay 1 and a black to return Heartseeker from your graveyard to play tapped and attacking. Now, in theory, this card looks great with tools like Ignited Soul, cheap evasive creatures that help you to fill your graveyard and then can slip this into play with its graveyard ability. However, this is another case of, these big go-wide synergies asking you to attack with a single creature. And in that context, it can be really awkward for Heartseeker to be so reliant on you just attacking with one body when that makes it harder to justify swinging with multiple creatures if you've got the Heartseeker in your graveyard. It's a fine card, but as I've expressed before, I'm skeptical of how a lot of these exalted support tools will fare. Inklight Dancer is a rare adventure card from Kitsuo that I just unabashedly like. It and its adventure are both 2 mana, and its spell, being an instant named Stroke of Light, gives a creature -2/-2 for the turn, while the main body is a 1/3 that lets you pay a black mana instant speed to sacrifice a creature and drain your opponent for 1. It's a pretty simple card, and I appreciate how well the individual components come together. It's a better stable sacrifice outlet than something like Blighted Mistress, since it actively contributes to killing your opponent for less mana on a repeatable fashion at instant speed, and a better small removal spell than something like Downlink Overload, because while it costs 1 more to cast, it functionally draws you the creature have to cast later, and only needs to be used in matchups where it's prescient to do so. It's a simple tool for Aristocrats decks, but one that I think will be very important to their success. Grognard is not a card I have hopes for, but its mention does demand I finally drag a card I'll be talking about in the second part into the spotlight. Grognard is a 2-mana 2/2 that levels up for 2 and a black, but never has its base stats change. Instead, it starts getting a +1/+1 buff for each creature or enchantment card in your graveyard at level 1, and at level 3 it starts counting your opponent's graveyard too. I feel weird about calling this card even something worth talking about, as it's ultimately a very clunky body that requires some additional mana to make, well, work. However, one major support tool that helps prop it and most of the semi-viable level up cards up is Califax Dungeon Master, a 3-mana 2/3 legendary skeleton wizard in white and black. Califax can put level up counters on your other creatures, one at every one of your combats, and grants a level up ability to creatures that don't have one, passively giving them +1/+1 for each level counter they have. Grognard into Califax is a kind of clunky curve generally, but if you have at least like something turn 1 that starts to fill your graveyard, Califax curving out after Grognard can allow you to start piling up the level counters immediately and circumventing that 3-mana level cost. We'll get into Califax again in multicolor and talk about them in far greater detail, but they're the core thing that helps contextualize why I'm bothering with this 2/2 at all. And to be clear, Grognard has all of the problems I highlighted around Wicked Manifestation, so I don't think too highly of it in a general sense. Exorcist of Errors is a fascinating temporary hand attack tool, coming down as a 2/3 human warlock for 1 and a black, and on enter, forcing a player to split their hand into a face-up and face-down pile. You get to pick and reveal one of those piles, and choose a non-land card from it to exile for as long as Exorcist is in play. Dissect Intel is pretty much the de facto hand attack spell right now on account of it exiling the chosen card for no life lost, and while Intel has other synergies with the integrate package from Cyberos, Exorcist is an interesting aggressive twist. While it doesn't take the card for good like Intel, it's a solid tempo hit that can meaningfully interfere with your opponent's plan for the turn after you play it, which could have a ripple effect for your opponent's ability to get set up. We've seen these kinds of temp hand attack creatures for 2 generally be popular and constructed like standard, and while the sub-game Exorcist plays can result in you making subpar exile choices, I've seen far weaker stat lines with similar enter triggers get serious constructed play, so this could be worth trying. Next, we have a pair of removal spells, this time with a remarkable degree of similarity about them. Hang and Drag into the Dark are both 1 and a black instants that can conditionally destroy any creature, though both has hoops required and a limitation set if you can't jump through those hoops. For Hang, it destroys the creature guaranteed if it has 3 or less power, and otherwise requires you to control a permanent with mana value 3 or greater to make it work. Drag into the Dark, meanwhile, checks for mana value 3 or less on the creature it's killing, otherwise requiring you to have sacked a permanent in the given turn for it to blow up anything. Both are sweet, and have things that the other misses in a vacuum. But I'm generally a bigger fan of Drag into the Dark, as you can generally plan to have more control over the damage trigger, whereas your opponent can actually cause Hang to fail if you only have one permanent corrupting it and they remove it before Hang resolves. That said, Hang's condition is more generally universal, so either could be worth the include. Just remember that they both only deal with creatures, so make sure you have separate answers for planeswalkers. We also are getting Ruiner's Execution, which slots into the space currently occupied only really by Omen of Slaughter. Execution's another 2-mana instant, and this one lets you choose between making each opponent sacrifice a creature that's 1 or fewer colors, or 2 or more colors. This is honestly a great flexible tool for situations where Omen can't quite cut it, namely into these mid-range piles leaning on early mana dorks and cards like Contest Coordinator to bridge into potent engines like Kaineos. Execution lets you force your opponent to sacrifice Kaineos even in the face of a Contest Coordinator eager to bite the bullet, which is a major gain. Execution's also entering the format in a set flush with multicolor support tools for half of the color pairings, so this is an additional impact on how reliable it'll shake out. We'll have to see how it plays compared to Omen for the enchantment's final season in Constructed, but between picking off Kaineos through Concords, Electes, or Amber past a Calamity Cat, or a key multicolor piece past an Ignited Soul, Ruiner Execution has the staying power to make an impact. With all of these 2-mana removal spells, it's a good thing we also have a way to peel cards out of the graveyard for 2 mana as well. Stain Strokes is 1 and a black for a sorcery that returns a creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to play with an Exalted counter on it. This is a great resource for those Scophos Conqueror Barbarous Rough Rider decks to help keep your Haymakers coming back in, and the fact that it can also serve to rebuy a devoted lackeys makes it really appealing, albeit not perfect as a replacement to the old version of Extraction Mission if you're really trying to avoid having to spend all of that mana on the X cost. While Mission's value from red mana getting an extra temp copy is pretty huge, saving a mana to get Stain Strokes on a 3-drop or even a 2-drop feels very worthwhile. It's also worth noting that this gets back 2 of the 3 Titans for Sultai Golems, which is especially relevant with how the Golem tools were getting this rotation, and with how Extraction Mission has fared in Golems this World Championship so far have looked. That being said, part of why Missions is good with Golems is because it puts a copy of the Golem that gets into play, so we'll have to see if this can perform as well without that clause. Merciless Ruiner has a harder time stacking up to Omen of Slaughter, I think. It is a 2/1 human rogue samurai for 2 and a black, and comes with an exalted and an enter trigger. Comes with exalted and an enter trigger to force each player to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker. Coming back to bite you seems reasonable on a creature you can flicker or reanimate, but the body here is really rough, and I don't think the exalted trigger meaningfully salvages it. Ultimately, this is a 3-mana sorcery speed Omen, which just does not seem useful with Merciless Execution around. At least it checks planeswalkers on an otherwise empty board, though of the heavily played planeswalkers, there are a couple that it really struggles to deal with because they just make creatures to sacrifice. Seeker of the Pre-Weft is a weirdo, a 3-mana 4/4 with a big hoop to jump through, requiring you to exile 3 or more unique creature cards from your graveyard to actually cast it. From there, when it attacks, the defending player chooses one of the exiled creatures to get out and play. Having played Spiky Jack's Gravetiller a decent bit, which has a familiar play pattern, I can confidently say Seeker is going to require some heavy lifting in both deck building and play patterns to make it reliable. If you can get it rolling, I like the aggressive lean it has by not taxing you on mana for the cards you're getting back. And presumably, if they're worth including in your deck, then the creatures you're exiling have to be at least a little worthwhile, even if your opponent gives you the worst of the ones you've exiled on each attack trigger. It's also got 1 more health than Spiky, which is nice, even if it's not got the repeatability and resilience of Spiky in a longer-term plan. I think the most appealing use for Seeker is actually with some of the big cycling creatures, especially as you can find an avenue to slip this thing into play with haste, such as off of a Calamity Cat, because Seeker of the Pre-Weft looks a lot scarier when you're running, when you're getting back massive bodies you're running for their cheap cycling costs. That being said, the cycling plan's probably a bit too janky. Borrow is a huge value bomb for 3 mana, but with a long-term drawback, in theory. This subroutine casts for 1 black, and on enter, it creates you 2 2/2 flying birds and draws you 2 cards and gains you 2 life. However, when it leaves the battlefield or runs, it forces you to sacrifice a creature, discard a card, and lose 1 life. At a baseline, if you can sacrifice this immediately, it's a 2/2 flyer that can let you have a second to keep if you care about something else being sacrificed, and forces you to draw 2 cards, discard 1, and ultimately just gain you 1 life. I've seen folks scheme about ways to move Borrow out of play and get rid of its trigger so you don't have to worry about losing anything, but I think that's just the wrong way to approach this. It's a super strong top-end card for a deck that's been gaining some momentum thanks to this March buff patch, with mono black Devotion aggro. Aggro is already a deck inclined towards looking for swarms of attackers and card draw, and Borrow gets to play at both of those components on turn 3, with the understanding that if you put Borrow on program C, you'll lose some resources on turn 6. With so many subroutines feeling like they're held back by the sluggishness of program progression, Borrow meaningfully flips that problem on its head and turns it into a benefit, keeping this drawback slowed down so you can play into its strengths and keep up the momentum for a deck that's already keen on keeping the cards flowing, the board wide, and the creatures dangerous but expendable. And of course, the kicker here is that the sacrifice and discard clauses can even be an advantage if you have disposable creatures you're happy to get the death triggers out of, cards in hand that work better in your graveyard, or you just need to turn Damned on for a card in your hand. And because you get to set it so far in advance, you get ample time to actively prepare for Borrow's run trigger. This card is so strong in my mind, and I really hope people do start to recognize that you don't have to try and work around getting past the leaves trigger. You can just keep this in play and get some really strong power out of it. Wretched Bargain is an interesting 3-mana draw 2, costing 2 and a black, and doing the usual draw 2, lose 2 at sorcery speed, but it refunds you 2 black mana if you sacrificed a permanent the turn you cast it. It's an interesting parallel to Nurture the Future, which got buffed back in March to have a similar function as a pseudo 1-mana draw 2, though Nurture scries 2 before it draws, and requires more developed board state to effectively get the 2 mana discount without having to wait to rebuy that mana. So you only have to spend 1 mana up front. Nurture's Scry makes it better at a baseline, but I do think Wretched Bargain's not requiring a well-established board state and having a more reliable condition that doesn't place color restrictions on it makes me curious to see how it'll play. Worth noting, of course, that we have Primal Fissure and Redeveloped Cityscape in the field, as well as the new errors in the Weft fetches, so Damned is pretty consistent to keep active from lands alone. Cheat Code is a level up centric modal spell that seems interesting, but is held back by level up's weaknesses. For 2 and a black, this sorcery lets you choose X of its modes, where X is 1 plus the number of creatures you control with level counters on them. That is really important. You can't just have level up creatures in play, you need them to actively develop those counters. You can have each opponent discard 2 cards, have each creature you don't control get -1/-1 for the turn, or have each opponent lose 3 life and you gain 3 life. Because this is predicated on having level counters on creatures in play, the scenarios where this can be used for multiple modes reliably are few and far between. And if you aren't getting multiple modes here, we really do need to just evaluate how good this would be as just a choose one. And in that regard, it's pretty ignorable. I'm not sure aggro decks would be eager to run a 3-mana drain 3 on its own, and the flexibility for it to be a mind rot or a way to clear tokens doesn't do a ton to salvage it. The biggest comparable card I can think of is Salice's Vengeance, which is felt scary to be on the receiving end of, but that's because it threatens to push 6 damage if you can't discard or sacrifice cards locked out of pitching lands to either half of the effect. Even then, Vengeance has been a largely fringe piece in its year in the format, and while it could always have the chance to hit an upswing, I think it does so over the next year at Cheat Code's expense. Failed Gateway is a pretty simple but important sideboard tool we'd otherwise be losing this rotation. A -2/-2 sweeper for 1 and double black. We've had Drown in Sorrow for 2 years, and it's jumped in to replace other similar tools over the years in Revolution, but with Hyperpop leaving us in May, we were about to be without this on-again, off-again sideboard tool. Granted, we will also still have Chronicle of Extinction until next January, and I feel like folks know my general feelings on that card by now. So let's talk more about Failed Gateway instead. It's a conditional sweeper with Corrupt, only affecting your creatures if you fail to have a permanent with mana value 4 or greater. This can make it a more valuable tool in mid-rangey and ramp decks that can put larger permanents in play but have lower toughness mana dorks they might care about, or other lower toughness creatures, allowing them to use Failed Gateway out of the sideboard to mop up opposing creatures without risking their own board. I think it's a bit unreliable at doing that in all honesty, because the most of the higher cost Corrupt cards, it comes with the danger of opposing interaction taking away the ability for this to be corrupted. But I think Gateway still serves a necessary niche in the environment, even if a certain modal flashback spell will make it less relevant for its early months in the field. Jumping up to 4 mana, we have one of the most exciting level up cards out of Error in the Weft with Life Hacker. It is 2 black for a 4/4 human wizard with lifelink and level up for 1 mana and 4 life. From levels 1 through 4, it bumps up to a 5/5 and gains a triggered ability to draw you a card whenever you gain life. And at level 5 and beyond, it's a 6/6 that draws you cards equal to the life you gain. This is getting some ice as a mid-range and control tool in slower matchups where life totals are more of an expendable resource, being used fairly to generate card advantage with a faster clock. But it also has combo potential. You may recall some foreshadowing earlier about Moonlight Adversary having a combo I thought looked stronger than it being used with Emperor Zuhan. And that's because discarding the hand size with Moonlight Adversary while you have a leveled up Life Hacker in play instantly kills your opponent, provided you have more cards left in your library than they do life. Each time you're forced to discard a hand size, Adversary triggers to drain your opponent, and that life gain causes Life Hacker to draw a card, repeating the cycle. While normally assembling this combo while keeping a grip of 8 cards can be difficult, that's where the final piece of the puzzle comes into play. Ascend from Power is a policy enchantment from Cliques of Nylon that draws you 2 cards on enter for 2 and a black, provided you're willing to sacrifice a creature, discard a card, or pay 3 life to do so. From there, you have to mark a condition off on each of its 3 conditions over the next 3 turns, including the turn you play it, between having to sacrifice a non-land permanent in a turn, discarding a card in a turn, and losing life in a turn, all working towards Omnipotence, a legendary enchantment that sets your max hand size to 0 and lets you freely pay 1 life to draw a card as a sorcery. Lifehacker and Ascend already work well together, with an on-curve Ascend being unable to flip until turn 5, at which point you have just enough mana to play and level up Lifehacker, which just so happens to accomplish the final condition on Ascend to Power of losing life. This means you can focus on either discarding a card or sacrificing a creature to ascend enter trigger and accomplishing the other of its conditions on your 4th turn. From there, you just have to find a window on turn 2 or 4 to put Moonlight Adversary into play, and once you flip Omnipotence on turn 5, you can just pass your turn with a card in your hand. Because Omnipotence sets your hand size to 0, and it can always give you the card you need to start the loop, it's guaranteed to fire off the Lifehacker Adversary loop if left unchecked, draining your opponent to death while you continuously struggle in vain to discard down to 0 cards in hand. Time will tell if this combo has legs, but I love that each of the core pieces here all meaningfully engage with each other in favorable ways. Lifehacker helps you flip Ascend, Adversary having the infinite with Lifehacker, and Omnipotence being able to be used as burst damage if you have Adversary without Lifehacker. I don't know what shells will want this particular package, whether it's going to be something more mid-rangey, something more combo-y, something more control-y, but this combo seems rad. Up next is Conqueror's Glee, a brutal enchantment if you want to cause your opponent enough torment. For 2 and double black, this enchantment has 3 separate triggers, all tied to your opponent suffering for the first time in a turn. When they lose life for the first time, they lose 3 more. When they discard a card for the first time, they discard another. When they sacrifice a permanent, they sacrifice another non-land permanent. This is a debilitating stacks piece, especially in conjunction with old reliables like Fenax's Touch and Omen of Slaughter. It's also worth remembering that while we're getting new duels this coming season, we're still likely going to see a lot of people relying on Primal Fissure and Redeveloped Cityscape to make mana bases smoother, and because that final triggered ability doesn't care what the opponent sacrifices, their fetch land can wind up biting them in the butt, as can their cycling cards. Any self-injuring effects they may be playing, any value enchantments or artifacts they may want to sacrifice. Glee has a ton of griefing potential that just naturally punishes some of the synergies available in the format, and while 4 mana can be a tough sell, it definitely has my attention. Next up, let's talk about a pair of cards that seem pretty important together. Death's Believers is 2 and a double black for a 1/3 Spirit Warlock with lifelink and a big corrupt ability. When it enters, it returns a creature card from your graveyard to your hand, but if you cast it and have a permanent with mana value 5 or greater, it can reanimate that creature instead. This is your current cheapest reanimation effect for bringing back any creature from your bin regardless, but the hoop here is pretty hard to jump through. Fortunately, we can lean on cost-reducing permanents to help us go the distance, such as Do Not Respond, a 4 and a black 5/5 error that you can cast for 1 and a black instead at the cost of giving your opponent 2 1/1 citizen tokens. DNR is a decently interesting stompy tool in its own right, albeit with an awkward drawback, but its synergy with Death's Believers is actually pretty big. Because you can cast this 5-drop for 2, it helps you meet the corrupt condition on turn 4, meaning you can spend turn 3 setting up our old pal Scourge of Capitalism, who gets pulled back from Death's Believers and even gets to punch one of those 1/1 citizen tokens as a bonus. I think Do Not Respond has some application outside of this strategy, but it's definitely a good tool to help corrupt cards like Death's Believers punch above their weight class. Keon Heap Exec feels like the perfect nightmarish evolution of everything Data Weaver and Inner Ring's Pupil stand for. Like the other members of the Exec cycle, Keon casts for 1 and quadruple black as a 5/5 with Menace. Whenever she enters or attacks, you make a player discard a card and then can choose to exile that card or the top card of their library. Once you've exiled a card, you have access to it for as long as it stays exiled. That is my computer. You have access to it for as long as it stays exiled, getting mana fixing to help you cast it. This is brutal into any attrition matchup, denying your opponent resources while generating more for you. While her cost makes her a bit difficult to use quickly, the fact that she triggers on enter means any removal spell against her is already a bit too late. To make matters better, she's particularly good into the banishing light-heavy environment we find ourselves in. If you needed more reason to try the non-permanent spells in white for your removal suite, just consider that exiling a Keon under a Gone Pickin' can only do so much if your opponent happens to hit another Gone Pickin' with her enter trigger off the top of your own deck, let alone if they happen to have their own removal for your enchantment to get her back and get that enter trigger again. The Inferno Gate opens is up next as our black contribution to the time loop cycle. For 4 and a black, you can pay any amount of life on the first chapter to create a demon token with power and toughness equal to the life you paid, drawing a card and losing 1 life on chapter 2, and giving one of your creatures lifelink on chapter 3. Put simply, I think this is the worst of the cycle by a significant margin. The potential here is really high, but there isn't a ton of great ways to leverage the large demon that has no evasion or any form of text beyond the big numbers at the bottom right of the token. And between the life loss in the first chapter and the additional pain of the second chapter, it feels hard to sell this as a tool for the kind of slower deck that might want to weaponize time loops more efficiently. I've said most of what there is to say about reanimation spells at this point, but Reboot does have a bit of extra kick to it. For 3 black at sorcery speed, it lets you Surveil 2, then places a delayed trigger on the stack to reanimate something from your graveyard. The Surveil allows you to try and gamble for a good creature to mill if you don't already have one in the bin, but it's not very consistent. And I don't imagine the scenarios where you actually hit when you need to will outshine the many cases where gambling with the Surveil 2 just bites you in the butt for casting a 5-mana reanimation spell with no good targets in the bin. It's a very swingy, high-rolly kind of card when you need it to be, and I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. Entropy Inversion is a very weird member of the inversion cycle, though I guess that's true of all of them to an extent. This 7/5 for 4 and triple black lets you cast creatures from your graveyard and from exile, including itself when it isn't in play, but comes with the drawback of replacing any events where your other creatures die or get exiled to instead put them on the bottom of your deck. It's hard to really pin why I don't love this, but I think it's somewhere in between not being the most powerful thing you could do in a black deck with a high cost creature that cares about your graveyard, and other similar cards that come down for cheaper also being largely unplayed and untested. It's got some weird cool things going for it, but I'm not sure that's a great marker of faith in it for Entropy Inversion. Cage, Cursed Conqueror is another legendary that casts for 4 and triple black, but this one's a 7/7 Demon Warrior with lifelink. While he's in play, whenever you pay life, you draw 7 cards. I'm not sure it's in contention for the best creatures to be reanimating right now, but the existence of the Coalesced lands as pieces in your mana base that let you pay life for no other cost, there is some potential power here, with Cage letting you turn through your deck rapidly while tapping your lands for mana. Also worth noting, Cage gets an extra bump on the list in Eternal, where a lot of our best reanimation targets want to be 7 mana for Unnatural Rebirth, which can't hit 8 mana creatures like the big bug I keep bringing up, or of course, Tyrant of Tributes. I know I've been kind of down on the evasion-less creatures that care about the number of cards in your graveyard that fit a certain condition, but I do find myself really liking Burnout Champion. It's a 5/4 cat warrior for 5 and double black, but it costs 1 less to cast for each creature or enchantment card in your graveyard. It has a ward cost to make your opponent discard a card to target it. Champion seems a big beneficiary of my fondness for Chittering Gargantua kinds of nonsense, as Champion can come down for 2 with 5 creature cards in your graveyard, ahead of Gargantua eating those cards to slip itself into play as well. There is some awkward tension between these 2 cards, which makes me suspect that you'll either want a lot of graveyard filling tools or probably just don't want them in the same deck, but you already know I'll be messing with this one. Our final card for this first half of the review is Privilege Escalation, another big error to close out a color. It is an 11/13 with Menace for 8 and double black. That 10 mana gets you an enter trigger to force your opponent to sacrifice each non-land permanent they control unless they pay life equal to that permanent's mana value plus 2. This is a big flashy board wipe that you can reanimate, but I'm not sure it's as scary as it looks. There's a lot of lethality here if your opponent gets greedy, and certainly the body demands your opponent check it immediately. And it's even worth noting that our usual Banishing Light options look pretty pale in the face of this. But even with all of that said, I just don't know. Reanimated players who have more experience with that kind of strategy will have a better grip on how this card can feel in those kinds of decks. But to me, this is an awkward card to include in your deck just on the hopes that you can cheat it out. And that concludes the first half of our competitive, comprehensive review of Kitsuo, Dusk of Time, and Errors in the Weft. There are still so many cards to dig into, from the red, green, multicolor, and colorless suites joining the field. I have over or at least close to 100 multicolor cards alone to talk about. So make sure to keep an eye on out here on the channel or in the Revolution Media tab on the Discord server for that second part when it comes out. Or if it's already out there, you should be getting an end card pointing you there any second now. Otherwise, check out all the links in the description if you want to do your own dive through the format and what we're gaining. In the meantime, take care of yourself, and I'll see you all in the Revolution chat. Bye-bye now.